Sheriff Dale Cutler walked the length of the church supper table with a glass of sweet tea in his hand and a smile carved onto his face like something painted on a storefront. He stopped directly behind Clara Whitlock, leaned down close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his collar, and said, loud enough for 6 families to hear, "Folks, I'd hate for anyone to lose their appetite sitting near stolen money." He didn't look at her. He looked at the crowd, and the crowd looked away. Every single one of them. If that were you, if every person in your community turned their back on you the week your brother was buried, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because every single week we bring you stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Now, don't you dare look away, because what happens next at that table is going to change everything. Clara Whitlock had been sitting at the far end of the third table for 11 minutes before she understood what was happening. She had arrived early. That had been deliberate. She'd told herself that arriving early was the dignified thing to do, that it would give her a chance to set her dish down, find a seat, and let the fact of her presence settle over the crowd before anyone had time to organize their discomfort into something visible. She had carried a covered dish of corn pudding, her mother's recipe, the one her brother Thomas had always asked for first at every gathering since they were children. She had made it the night before with shaking hands and red eyes, and she had told herself that bringing something to share was the kind of thing a person with nothing to hide would do. She should have known better. The families of Dry Hollow began arriving around 6 in the evening, when the summer heat had dropped just enough to make the church grounds bearable. The Hensons came first, then the Aldridge family, then 3 or 4 groups she didn't know well enough to name. Each family went through the same motion. They would cross the grass, see Clara already seated at the third table, and then, without saying a single word, without meeting her eyes, they would drift toward the first or second table, or they would find a spot at the far end where the shadows were thicker. A few of the older women pretended to be looking for something in their baskets. 2 men she'd known since childhood suddenly found the fence post near the tree line enormously interesting. Not one person sat within 10 feet of her. She kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her chin level. She had promised herself on the walk over that she would not cry in front of these people, and she intended to keep that promise even if it took every piece of steadiness she had left in her body. Thomas was dead. He had been dead for 6 days. She had not slept more than a few hours in any of those nights, and the corn pudding she'd carried across half a mile of dry road had gone cold in the dish because she'd had to stop twice on the walk over, just to breathe through the tightness in her chest. She was 29 years old, and she was completely alone in a crowd of 60 people who had known her name since before she could read. It was Martha Aldridge who said it first, or at least Martha was the first one Clara actually heard clearly enough to be certain. Martha was a stout woman with a voice built for carrying across open fields, and whatever she was trying to accomplish by leaning toward Eleanor Henson and dropping her volume, she did not accomplish it very well. "I'm not saying she knew," Martha murmured, "but the apple doesn't fall far, does it?" Eleanor said something back that Clara couldn't make out. Then Martha said, $340, Eleanor. That's real money. That's not a mistake." Clara stared at the dish in front of her. $340. That was the number everyone had settled on. The amount supposedly missing from the miners' emergency fund, the fund that Thomas had been helping to manage for the past 4 months as a volunteer bookkeeper. The same Thomas who had never owned more than 2 shirts at once, who had sent half his wages home when their mother was sick 2 winters ago, who had fixed the Henson barn roof for free just last autumn because old Gerald Henson's back had gone out and the rain was coming. That Thomas. A thief. She had heard the story from 4 different directions in the days since his death, and each version was slightly different in its details but identical in its conclusion. Thomas Whitlock had stolen the emergency fund and, when confronted, had gone up to the canyon ridge and fallen. Or jumped, some people whispered, though they were decent enough not to say that directly to Clara's face. The money had never been found. The ledger Thomas had been keeping showed a gap that nobody could explain. The sheriff had called it an accident and written it up that way, and that should have been the end of it. Except Clara knew her brother. And she knew it wasn't. She hadn't said that to anyone yet. Not officially, not in a way that invited argument. She was still gathering herself. She was still trying to find the ground under her feet. Every morning for 6 days she had woken up in the cabin she and Thomas shared, and for 1/2 second, just one, she had forgotten that he was gone. And then the forgetting would end and the remembering would crash back in, and she would have to start the whole day over again from that point. She reached for the ladle in the corn pudding dish just to have something to do with her hands. That was when she heard the boots on the dry grass behind her. She didn't turn around. She thought it was probably someone walking past on their way to a different table, and she had already trained herself not to flinch at footsteps. But the boots stopped, right behind her. And then the smell of tobacco hit her, and even before the voice came, something in her stomach pulled tight. "Folks," said Sheriff Dale Cutler, and his voice had that particular quality it always had in public, easy and rounded and shaped for an audience. "I'd hate for anyone to lose their appetite sitting near stolen money." The words landed like a flat stone dropped into still water. Clara felt them before she understood them, felt them in her shoulders and her jaw and the back of her throat. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the dish, and she kept her hands still, and she breathed in through her nose, slow and careful, the way she had learned to breathe when she was a girl and their father was in one of his moods, and the safest thing was to make yourself small and quiet and impossible to catch. Dale Cutler laughed, a short, casual sound, as if he'd said something charming, and walked on toward the first table where the important men of Dry Hollow were already settling in with their plates. And then it happened. The last people still standing near the third table picked up their things and moved. Clara was alone. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table, felt the rough grain of the wood against her palms, and told herself that she was not going to stand up, and she was not going to leave, and she was not going to give Dale Cutler the satisfaction of watching her walk away with her dish and her dignity in pieces. But she also could not stop the heat that was climbing her neck, or the way her vision had gone slightly blurred at the edges, or the fact that her breath was coming in shallow and wrong. She had believed, she realized now, in the particular cruelty of understanding something too late, she had believed that people would be decent, not kind, necessarily, not openly supportive, but decent. She had believed that whatever they thought privately about Thomas, whatever rumors they had swallowed whole because it was easier than asking questions, they would at least be capable of sitting near her at a church supper without performing their suspicion for an audience. She had believed that 6 days of grief would buy her at least that much. She had been wrong. The sounds of the gathering went on around her, forks and voices, children somewhere near the fence, the specific low rumble of men talking about things they considered serious. Clara sat in the middle of all of it like a stone in a river, with everything moving around her and nothing touching her. And she thought about Thomas. She thought about the way he used to hum when he was doing figures, just under his breath, a wandering little tune that had no name. She thought about the morning 3 weeks before his death, when he had come in from the office looking pale and distracted, and she had asked him what was wrong, and he had said nothing. He was just tired, and she had believed him because she was busy and because it was easier to believe him, and she had thought about that moment every single day since they found his body at the base of the canyon. She was so deep in that thought that she didn't hear the new footsteps until they were already at the bench. The man who sat down beside her was someone she had seen before but didn't know. He was tall enough that sitting down barely seemed to shrink him, with the kind of face that had been weathered past handsome into something more permanent. Deep lines at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, dark hair going gray at the temples. I was wearing a coat that had seen serious use and boots that had seen more. He set his plate on the table, reached for her dish of corn pudding without asking, and served himself a portion. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the food. "I ate standing up in a box canyon for 3 weeks last spring," he said, in a voice that was completely conversational, "because a rock slide took out the trail and I couldn't get down to town. So I've done worse than this." He picked up his fork. "Silas Boone. I run cattle up on the North Ridge." Clara stared at him. He chewed. He looked at his plate. He seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that 60 people had just gone very, very quiet. "Clara Whitlock," she said, and her voice came out strange in her own ears. Thinner than she intended, with something raw underneath it that she hadn't meant to show. "I know who you are," he said. He wasn't being unkind about it. He was just saying it plainly, the way you'd confirm a fact. Then you know why everyone moved away from this table. He glanced up at her then, just briefly, just long enough for her to see that his eyes were a dark, tired brown, and that there was something in them that wasn't pity. She had plenty of experience with pity in the past 6 days, and she knew exactly what it looked like. This wasn't that. I know what they're saying, he said. He looked back at his plate. I don't eat with cowards. The silence around them stretched out long enough that Clara became aware of it as a physical thing. The held breath of a crowd, trying to decide whether what they were watching was remarkable or simply strange. She heard someone shift on a bench 20 feet away. She heard a child ask a question and get hushed immediately. She looked at her own plate, at the corn pudding she hadn't touched, and she tried to understand what she was feeling. It wasn't gratitude exactly. Or rather, it was gratitude threaded through with something sharper, something almost like anger, because it shouldn't have taken a stranger from the North Ridge to make her feel like a human being at a church supper. It shouldn't have required an act of pointed courage just to establish that she had the right to be there. But it had. And he had done it, and here they both were. She picked up her fork. It's cold now, she said, nodding at the corn pudding. It was better warm. Most things are, Silas said. They ate in silence for a little while, and the crowd around them slowly, grudgingly returned to the business of supper. And Clara Whitlock sat up straight and kept her chin level and told herself that whatever came next, whatever any of them were going to throw at her, she had already survived the worst minute of this evening, and she was still sitting at this table, and her brother's name was not going to end with the word thief, not if she had anything to do about it. It was another 20 minutes before Silas spoke again. The crowd had thinned somewhat around their end of the table, people coming and going for second helpings and small conversations. And in the relative privacy of that shifting movement, he set down his fork and leaned forward slightly on his elbows, and his voice dropped to something that wasn't quite a whisper, but was careful. I need to tell you something, he said, about where I was the morning your brother died. Clara stopped eating. The air between them changed. I was up on the North Ridge, he said, working cattle near the canyon overlook, early, before sunrise. He paused. He was choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on unstable rock, deliberately, one step at a time. I saw something I haven't told anyone yet, because I needed to decide who to tell, whether it mattered. Whether it mattered, she repeated, and she was surprised by how flat her voice went, how completely stripped of warmth. He looked at her directly. I needed to decide who I could trust to hear it, that's all. She studied him. He had the particular stillness of a man accustomed to being alone. Not tense, not performing, just settled into himself in a way that people rarely managed in crowds. She didn't know him. She didn't have any reason to trust him. She also had nothing left to lose, which had a remarkable way of clarifying decisions. Tell me, she said. He told her. He told her about the 2 horses he'd seen on the canyon trail before sunrise, not 1, 2, and how he'd watched from the high ground as 2 figures moved along the rim, and how one of them had not come back down the way they'd gone up. He told her about the sound he'd heard, not a fall, or what you'd expect a fall to sound like, but something that came before that, something that didn't fit the story of a man walking alone in the dark and losing his footing. He told her that he'd come down later, after full light, and found a place on the rim where the ground was disturbed in a way that wasn't right for an accident, and that he had been carrying that information for 6 days, trying to figure out what to do with it. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. She kept her hands in her lap, below the table, where he couldn't see that they had curled into fists. When he finished, she said, "You waited 6 days." "Yes, while they were calling my brother a thief and a coward." He didn't look away from her. "Yes." She wanted to be furious at him. The fury was there, she could feel it, clean and hot. But underneath it was something else, something that recognized the impossible position of a lone cattleman with no standing in this town, trying to decide whether to walk into the sheriff's office with a story that contradicted the sheriff's official account. She understood why he'd waited. She didn't forgive him for it, but she understood it. "The 2 horses," she said. "Did you see the riders clearly?" "Not clearly. It was dark, but one of them was wearing something that caught what light there was." He paused. It was a lawman's badge. The words sat between them. From the first table, Clara could hear Dale Cutler laughing at something, his big, comfortable laugh, the laugh of a man who controlled the room and knew it. She looked in his direction without meaning to, and when she looked back at Silas, he was watching her with that same steady, non-pitying attention. "We can't go to him," she said. "No." "And we can't stay quiet." "No," he said again. She looked at her plate. The corn pudding had gone completely cold. She had made it from her mother's recipe, the one Thomas had always loved, and she had carried it across half a mile of road, and not one person at this gathering had touched a single spoonful of it except the one stranger who had decided to sit beside her. "What did you find on the rim?" she asked. "Specifically, what did you actually see?" He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and set something on the table between them, low and flat, half hidden by the edge of the dish. It was a piece of cloth, stained dark, not large, about the size of a man's palm, torn at the edge as if it had been caught on something. "There was more," he said, "but this is what I kept." Clara looked at the cloth. She did not touch it. "That's not trail dirt," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." Somewhere behind her, she heard Sheriff Cutler's voice rise again, talking about something that made the men around him chuckle and nod. The supper sounds continued, ordinary, domestic, the sounds of a community that had decided on its story and was comfortable inside it. Clara Whitlock sat at the end of the third table with a man she didn't know and a piece of stained cloth between them, and she felt something happen inside her that she didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't hope exactly. It was older and harder than hope. It was the feeling of a door that had been closed very firmly, suddenly showing light at its edge. Her brother had not stolen anything. Her brother had not fallen from that canyon because of guilt or despair or carelessness in the dark. Her brother had known something, or seen something, or been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. And someone in this valley had decided that was a problem that needed to be solved in a permanent way. She was going to find out who. And she was going to make sure that when the truth came out, it came out in a way that could not be buried again. She reached across the table and picked up the cloth. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." And Silas Boone, who had eaten standing up in a box canyon for 3 weeks and who did not eat with cowards, set his elbows on the table and began. The piece of cloth sat on the table between them for a long moment before Clara folded it carefully into her palm and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. She didn't look around to see if anyone had noticed. Looking around was the kind of thing a guilty person did, and she was done performing innocence for this crowd. "2 horses," she said, keeping her voice low and her eyes on the dish in front of her like she was talking about the food. "You're certain it was 2? "I counted them twice," Silas said. He had gone back to eating, or at least going through the motions of it, fork moving, jaw working, but his attention was somewhere else entirely. "I was up on the overlook because I'd lost a calf the night before, and I wanted the high ground at first light to see where it had drifted. That's why I was there early. That's why I saw it at all." "What time exactly?" "Maybe an hour before sunrise, maybe a little less. Sky was still black in the east, but you could feel it changing." Clara did the math without meaning to. Thomas had left their cabin the night before, told her he had paperwork to finish at the land office, said it would run late, not to wait up. She hadn't questioned it. He'd been keeping odd hours for weeks, and she had told herself it was the bookkeeping work, that volunteer positions always ended up eating more time than anyone planned. She had gone to sleep. She had woken up at 6 in the morning to the sound of Gerald Henson knocking on the door with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she had never seen on him before. An expression she hadn't had a word for until later, when she finally identified it as the look of a man who was about to change someone's life permanently and didn't want the job. "He told me he was going to the land office," she said. Silas said nothing. "He didn't have any business at the canyon. None. Thomas didn't even like heights. He never went up on the ridge unless he had a specific reason." She heard her own voice and made a deliberate effort to bring it down, steady it. "Someone brought him there. That's what I think. Or he found out he needed to go there, found out something that sent him up that trail." Silas set his fork down and turned his cup in a slow circle on the table, the way a man does when he's organizing his thoughts. "There's a third possibility," he said. "He arranged to meet someone there. Someone he trusted." The word trusted landed somewhere in Clara's chest with a particular kind of weight, because if Thomas had trusted someone enough to meet them at the canyon rim in the dark, That someone was almost certainly a person he knew well, a person from Dry Hollow, a person who might be sitting at one of these tables right now, eating their supper, listening to Dale Cutler's comfortable laugh, with 6 days of Thomas Whitlock's death already settled and catalogued and filed away. She looked at Cutler from across the gathering. He was leaning back on the bench with his thumbs in his vest pockets, talking to 2 men she recognized, Harlan Briggs, who owned the town's only bank, and a younger deputy named Rourke, who had the particular hollow-eyed look of someone who did what he was told and didn't ask why. Briggs was nodding at something Cutler said. He had a way of nodding that looked like agreement but felt, if you watched it long enough, more like the practiced motion of a man confirming that things were going according to plan. "Tell me about the ground," Clara said. "The disturbed ground on the rim. What exactly did you see?" Silas described it the way a man describes terrain, practically, without embellishment, in the language of someone who had spent years reading land for a living. There had been 2 sets of boot prints leading to the edge, not one. One set had a longer stride, heavier, pressing deep into the soft soil near the rim. The other, and this was the part that had stayed with him, the part he kept returning to when he lay awake at night. The other set had scuffed and dragged at the heel, the pattern of a man struggling to plant his feet, struggling against something or someone. "And then just the one set walking away," he said. Clara realized she was gripping the edge of the bench so hard that her knuckles had gone pale. She released it deliberately. "You said you kept the cloth," she said. "Was there anything else you left? Anything still up there?" He hesitated just a moment. "I covered the ground as best I could, smoothed it. I didn't know what I was going to do with what I knew yet, and I didn't want anyone who went back up there to know they'd been watched." "Did anyone go back up there?" 2 of Cutler's deputies were up on that trail the afternoon of the day they found Thomas. "I saw them from below. They weren't searching." He paused. They were erasing. The supper continued around them. Someone had brought out a fiddle somewhere near the front of the gathering, and a few notes drifted across the grass, tentative and wandering, like the player was warming up. Children had started chasing each other around the fence posts. It was an ordinary summer evening in a small frontier town, and it looked so completely normal that Clara felt something close to nausea at the gap between what she was sitting inside and what everyone around her could see. She thought about Thomas's office. She had been in there once since his death. Just once, the day after the funeral, when she'd gone to gather up his personal belongings. The land office manager, a thin, nervous man named Prewitt, had let her in with visible reluctance and hovered near the door the whole time she was there. She hadn't thought much about it at the time. She'd been in shock, moving through tasks mechanically, picking up her brother's spare reading glasses and his extra pen and the little carved wood horse he kept on his desk that had belonged to their father. She hadn't looked at any of the ledgers or files. It hadn't occurred to her to look. She had been too deep inside the grief to think like an investigator. She thought about it now. "The fund ledger," she said. "The one they say shows the gap. Where is it kept?" "Land office, I'd assume. Or the bank." "Which one does Briggs control?" Silas glanced toward the first table, just briefly. "Briggs runs the Valley account. He'd have counter-signature authority on any fund that size. The miners' emergency fund would have gone through his bank. So Briggs would have access to the ledger." "Briggs would have the ledger." Clara looked at Harlan Briggs again. He was 50-something, well-fed in the specific way of men who ate at other people's expense, with silver hair and a quality to his clothes that quietly communicated that he considered himself a different category of person from most of Dry Hollow. He had been in the valley for 12 years and had arrived with enough capital to establish the bank before the town was fully built, which meant that by the time anyone started asking questions about who he was and where he'd come from, he already owned too much of what they needed to be inconvenient. She had never disliked him before. She had simply not thought about him very much. That, she understood now, was probably not an accident. Men like Briggs were careful to be uninteresting until they needed to be otherwise. Silas pushed his plate back a few inches and lowered his voice another degree. "There's something else I didn't tell you yet." She waited. 3 weeks before your brother died, I came down off the ridge for supplies. I was at Garrity's store and Thomas came in while I was there. We'd met a few times. He was a friendly man. You know how he was. He'd talk to anyone. We got to talking, and he said something that I didn't know what to make of at the time. He said he'd found a number that didn't belong. In the ledger? He didn't say which ledger. He said he'd found a number that didn't belong and that the more he looked at it, the worse it got. I asked him what he was going to do about it, and he said he was trying to figure out if he was reading it wrong. He said sometimes you see something wrong in a column of figures, and it's just a copying error, and sometimes it's something else, and that you have to be careful about which one you're dealing with before you open your mouth. He paused. He seemed worried. Not scared exactly. Worried. Like a man trying to solve a problem that kept getting bigger the longer he looked at it. Clara sat with that for a moment. The fiddle had gotten more confident now, and someone had started clapping along. The sounds felt very far away. "He didn't tell me any of this," she said. And then with more difficulty, "He was protecting me." Probably. He was carrying it alone because he didn't want me involved. He sounds like someone who would do that. "Yes," she said quietly. "He does." They sat without speaking for a minute. Around them the gathering moved and breathed and made its ordinary sounds, and Clara thought about all the evenings she and Thomas had sat on the porch of their cabin talking about nothing particular. The price of things, the weather coming off the mountains, the neighbors, old memories, plans that were small and specific and real. She thought about how completely she had failed to understand that her brother had been walking towards something dangerous during all of those evenings, and how he had kept his face ordinary and his voice easy so that she wouldn't know. "I need to get into that land office," she said. Silas looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, more like a man who had known this was coming but was checking to make sure she'd thought it through. "Prewitt keeps it locked after hours, and Prewitt talks to Cutler regularly." "I know." "So whatever you're thinking, it would need to be during business hours, and you'd need a reason to be there that Prewitt couldn't question." "I have a reason," Clara said. "Thomas's personal effects. Prewitt let me come for his personal things once already. I could go back, say I realized I missed something, his spare ink bottle, anything." She felt the plan taking shape under her hands like clay, still rough, far from finished. "But I'd need enough time alone in the office to look at the financial files, and Prewitt won't leave me unsupervised. Not unless something distracts him." She looked at Silas. He had already been thinking about it. She could tell by the particular absence of surprise on his face. He had come to this supper not just to sit beside her, she realized. He had come with the intention of telling her what he knew and then figuring out what they were going to do about it. He had been thinking about this for 6 days, same as she had, just from a different angle and with different information, and now they were both at the same table looking at the same problem. "You're not from this town," she said. "No. You don't have any stake in what happens here." He looked at her steadily. "A man was killed," he said. "That's stake enough." She wanted to ask him more, about why he had come down off the mountain specifically to be at this gathering, whether he had known who she was before he sat down or only guessed, whether the deliberateness of his arrival was as calculated as it had looked from the outside. But she didn't ask. Not here. Not with 60 pairs of eyes distributed across this lawn, and at least one pair belonging to a man with a badge and a very strong interest in the official story remaining exactly as it was. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early. Can you come to my cabin?" "What time?" 6. "I'll be there," he said. He picked up his plate. He had actually eaten most of what was on it, which she found inexplicably steadying. The ordinary human fact of a man finishing his supper in the middle of a conversation about murder. He stood, and for a moment he was standing beside her, and she was aware that the people who had been watching them from a careful distance were watching again now, reading the body language of a stranger and a disgraced woman at the far end of a near-empty table. "Don't react to anything tonight," he said, low and flat, not quite looking at her. "Whatever Cutler says on his way out, whatever anyone says. You're just a woman who came to supper." "I know how to hold my face," Clara said. "I didn't say you didn't." He looked down at her then, briefly. "I'll see you at 6. He walked away across the grass, and Clara sat alone again at the third table with the folded piece of stained cloth in her pocket, and 6 days of grief reshaping itself inside her into something harder and more directed. She picked up her fork. She made herself take a bite of the corn pudding. It was cold and slightly stiff, and tasted like her mother's kitchen, and like every supper she and Thomas had ever eaten together. She ate it anyway, all of it, because she needed to, and because she was not going anywhere. Prewitt was a man who organized his anxiety into lists. Clara had noticed this the first time she came to the land office. The way he kept his desktop in strict geometric order. The way he moved through tasks in visible sequence. The way his eyes traveled to the clock on the wall at intervals that suggested a schedule running constantly in the back of his mind. He was not a bad man exactly. He was a small man in the particular sense of a person who had learned very early that staying within defined boundaries kept trouble at bay, and who had arranged his entire existence around that strategy. He was also, Clara had concluded, terrified of something. She had written it off the first visit as simple awkwardness around grief. Now she understood it differently. She arrived at the land office at 9:30 the morning after the church supper, while the street outside was still moving with the early activity of merchants opening their shops and ranch hands passing through on errands. Silas had come to her cabin at 6 as promised, and they had spent 2.5 hours going over what they knew and what they needed. And by the time she walked into that office, she had a plan that was specific enough to be useful and flexible enough to survive contact with reality. She knocked on the open door and waited for Prewitt to look up from his desk. "Miss Whitlock," he said, and his face did the thing it had done last time. A rapid series of adjustments, like a man cycling through possible expressions and settling on one that was generically sympathetic without committing to specifics. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sorry to come without warning," she said. She kept her voice soft and her posture slightly collapsed in a way she hated, but that served a purpose. The specific physical language of a woman who was still not quite managing her grief, which was true enough to be convincing because it was largely true. "I realized I left something of Thomas's here. His pen case. It was a birthday gift from our mother. I didn't see it when I came for his things, and I've been worried it might have been misplaced." Prewitt stood immediately. Of course. Let me—" He moved toward the back room where Thomas's small workspace had been, and Clara followed at the pace of a woman who was not in any hurry, looking around the main office with eyes that she kept soft and unfocused, so that nothing she noticed would register as noticing. The filing cabinet in the corner. Second drawer from the top, which was slightly less dusty on the handle than the others. The stack of ledgers on the side table, bound in different colors. Dark green for the town accounts, burgundy for the bank correspondence, and there, thin and pale blue, the one that looked newer than the others and was sitting on the bottom of the stack with what appeared to be deliberate casualness. Prewitt was in the back room murmuring to himself, going through the shelf above Thomas's old desk. Clara was in the doorway, watching him with the appropriate expression of anxious hope. She had maybe 4 minutes before he gave up on the pen case, which was not real, which she had invented, and which was therefore not going to be found no matter how long he looked. She needed a distraction. Right on time she heard it. The sound of a horse being pushed hard up the main street, the particular crack of hooves on dry dirt that meant someone arriving in a hurry, and Prewitt, who was as susceptible to external events as a weather vane, paused his searching and cocked his head toward the front window. "Something happening out there," he muttered. "You should go look," Clara said. "It sounds urgent. I can keep looking in here. I know exactly what the case looks like. I won't bother anything." Prewitt hesitated for just a moment, pulled between his managerial instinct and his curiosity, and then the sound of voices rising outside settled it. He moved past her toward the front door, saying something over his shoulder about just being a moment, and Clara waited until she heard his footsteps cross the front office and stop at the threshold. She moved. The pale blue ledger came off the bottom of the stack with a soft, papery sound, and she opened it at the back, the most recent entries, and began reading as fast as she had ever read anything in her life. The handwriting was Thomas's for the first dozen pages, careful and even, the figures laid out in the neat columns he had learned from their father. Then, abruptly, the handwriting changed. Someone else had made entries over Thomas's, not erasing them exactly but writing new figures in the same spaces in a slightly different hand, and the discrepancy was visible if you were looking for it, and almost invisible if you weren't. The total in the final column did not match the running figures above it. She did the arithmetic in her head. She was fast with numbers, always had been, another thing she'd inherited from their father, and the gap was not $340. The gap was over $2,000. Someone had altered the ledger to make the missing amount look small, the kind of amount a single dishonest bookkeeper might pocket, rather than the amount that it actually was, which was the kind of amount that required considerably more planning and considerably more authority. She heard Prewitt's voice at the door. He was talking to someone, not yet finished, and she kept reading. Thomas had made notes in the margin of one of the earlier pages, tiny, written in the compressed script he used when he didn't have much space and needed to remember something. She had to tilt the book toward the window light to make them out. HB countersig. Original receipt does not match. Ask PR about May transfer. HB Harlan Briggs. PR. She thought for a moment. Prewitt. Raymond Prewitt. Thomas had been planning to ask Prewitt about a discrepancy involving Briggs. She heard Prewitt's footsteps returning, and she had the ledger back on the bottom of the stack and herself back in the doorway of the back room in the time it took to draw a full breath. She was looking at Thomas's old desk shelf with what she hoped was a convincingly unsatisfied expression when Prewitt came back in. "Just one of the Aldridge Ranch hands," he said. "Nothing important. I'm sorry, Miss Whitlock. I really don't see the pen case." "I must have taken it home with me and not remembered," Clara said. She let her voice go slightly unsteady. "I'm sorry to waste your time. I think I'm still not quite—" She stopped, touched the corner of her eye with one finger. "Thank you for looking." "Of course." His voice had gone thinner, the way people's voices go when they're relieved that a conversation is ending. "Of course. You take care of yourself." She walked back out into the bright morning with her hands steady and her heart hammering in $2,000 worth of arithmetic, rearranging everything she thought she knew about what had happened to Thomas. She had gone to that office looking for a gap in a ledger. What she found instead was evidence of a fraud so much larger than the official story that the official story wasn't even a cover-up anymore. It was a replacement. Someone hadn't just stolen from the miners' fund and blamed her brother. Someone had been systematically moving money through that fund for months, using Thomas's position as bookkeeper to create a paper trail that would point directly at him the moment they needed a name to attach to the missing money. And then when Thomas got close enough to the truth to be dangerous, they had removed him and let the altered ledger tell the rest of the story. She made herself walk at a normal pace to the end of the street, turned down toward the creek road, went another 200 yards, and then stopped behind the cottonwoods where Silas was waiting with the horses. He looked at her face and didn't ask how it went. He just waited. "It's not $340, she said. "It's more than 2,000. They changed the numbers to make it look small, to make it look like something Thomas could have done alone." Silas said nothing for a moment. Then, "Briggs." Thomas had his initials in the margin. He'd found the discrepancy and was already connecting it to Briggs. She looked at the ground, then back up. He was planning to ask Prewitt about it, which means Prewitt either warned Briggs that Thomas was asking questions, or Briggs had Prewitt watched closely enough that he found out anyway. Either way, Silas said, Briggs knew Thomas was close. And Cutler knew too. Cutler was there on the rim. You saw the badge. She was working through it as she spoke, laying it out piece by piece the way Thomas used to lay out figures. Find what's real. Find what connects. Find where the gaps are. This didn't happen in one night. This was planned over months. The fund, the ledger, Thomas's position, all of it was arranged in advance. Thomas was put in that bookkeeping job for a reason. Silas turned that over for a moment. Who suggested him for it? Clara went very still. She had not thought about that. She had assumed Thomas had volunteered. He was the kind of man who volunteered for things, who turned up for community work without being asked. But the position of bookkeeper for the emergency fund wasn't something you simply volunteered for. Someone had to recommend you, and someone else had to approve the appointment. I don't know, she said, but I know how to find out. The answer took 3 days to surface, and it came from the most unexpected direction. Clara had been careful in those 3 days, deliberately ordinary in her movements, going to Garrity's store for supplies, stopping to exchange the minimum necessary words with the few neighbors who still spoke to her, keeping her face in its grief expression rather than the other expression that was building underneath it. Silas stayed off the main road and out of sight, working his way back up toward the canyon overlook, to look at the ground again. Now that he knew precisely what he was looking for, it was old Emmett Swade who told her, without knowing he was telling her anything important. Emmett was 73 and had been in the valley longer than anyone else still living, and his memory was the kind that stored things in odd corners without organizing them into anything useful unless you knew exactly which corner to check. He ran the small mail depot out of his house on the east side of town, and Clara stopped in on the pretext of checking for a letter from her mother's sister in Ohio. While she waited, Emmett talked. He always talked. And in the middle of a long, wandering account of who had been receiving mail lately and what that might mean about their business and personal affairs. He said, "Your brother was a good man, Clara. I told Briggs that when he said he wanted Thomas for that fun job. I said, 'You want an honest man, you get Thomas Whitlock, because that boy is too stubborn to cut a corner even if the corner was trying to cut him first.'" Clara kept her face perfectly still. "Briggs asked about Thomas specifically?" she said. "Oh, well, he asked me who in the valley I trusted with figures. I told him Thomas. That was back in, January, February maybe, before the winter broke." He squinted at the ceiling as if the date were written there. "February, I think. Right around when the fund was being reorganized." Briggs had personally selected Thomas. Briggs had gone to the oldest, most trusted man in the valley and asked for a recommendation, and had gotten Thomas Whitlock's name, and had then installed Thomas in a position where he would have access to the exact records that Briggs was manipulating, and where, the moment Thomas got close enough to the truth, his name was already attached to the paperwork in a way that made him the most logical suspect. She walked home slowly, not from sadness, but because she needed the time to hold all the pieces in the right position simultaneously. Briggs had planned this. Cutler was involved, had been on the canyon rim, had run the investigation that closed too fast and too clean. Prewitt had either participated or been frightened into looking the other way. The ledger had been altered. The amount was 5 times what anyone believed. And her brother, who was too stubborn to cut a corner even when the corner was trying to cut him, had found the discrepancy and started asking questions, and had died for it on a canyon rim in the dark while she slept 12 miles away. When Silas came down from the ridge that evening, he was carrying something in a folded piece of canvas. Carefully, the way you carry something that matters. He set it on the table in her cabin and unwrapped it without speaking, and Clara leaned forward over the lamp. It was a document. Water-stained at one edge, one corner torn, but readable. It was a transfer receipt, handwritten, for $1,200 from the Miners' Emergency Fund to an account listed only by number. The date was May 14th, 3 weeks before Thomas died. The signature line had 2 names on it, Thomas R. Whitlock and Harlan J. Briggs. Except Thomas's signature was wrong. Clara had been looking at her brother's handwriting her entire life. She had grown up watching him sign his name on school exercises, on letters, on the property documents after their father died. She knew his signature the way she knew his voice, not by analysis, but by a knowledge so deep it didn't require thought. This was not his signature. "Where did you find this?" she said. "There's a rock shelf about 40 feet below the canyon rim," Silas said. "I think it came out of his coat when he fell, or was pushed. It had slid into a crevice in the rock. I almost missed it entirely. I was looking for boot prints, and I almost stepped past it." Clara straightened up and looked at him across the lamp. "They forged his signature," she said, "on the transfer receipt. They moved the money and put his name on it with a signature that's supposed to be his. If anyone ever questioned the amount, this document makes it look like he personally authorized the transfer. And if Thomas was dead, he couldn't contradict it. And if the ledger shows what they changed it to show, and this receipt is in the file, the whole story writes itself." She pressed her palm flat on the table next to the document. Thomas didn't just stumble onto a small shortage. He found a forged receipt with his own name on it. He understood exactly what they'd set up. He was going to expose it. And he arranged to meet someone to show them what he found, Silas said, or he was lured to that meeting. By someone he trusted enough to go out to the canyon rim in the dark. She stood up straight. "We need more. This document and the altered ledger. We need something that puts Briggs and Cutler in direct connection. Something that establishes the conspiracy, not just the fraud." "Briggs keeps a private journal," Silas said. She looked at him. "The woman who cleans his office mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it to the man I buy feed from," he said. "I have no idea what's in it. I have no idea if it mentions any of this. But a man running a fraud that size, he's going to keep a record somewhere because men like Briggs don't trust anyone else to remember the arrangement correctly." "Where does he keep it?" "His private office. Back room of the bank? Behind the painting of the mountain that everyone says is ugly, but he's had up since he arrived." Clara looked at the document on the table, then at the lamp, then at the door of her cabin, beyond which the valley sat in its summer dark, full of people who had moved away from her at a church supper, and a banker who had murdered her brother, and a sheriff who had watched and helped and called it an accident and gone home to his supper. "I need to see that journal," she said. "I know," said Silas. He looked at the canvas wrapping on the table. We're going to need to move faster than we thought. If they figure out you were looking at the ledger today, if Prewitt says anything to Cutler about your visit, they'll know I'm not just grieving, Clara finished. They'll know you're looking. And once they know that, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both understood what men like Briggs and Cutler did when a loose thread started pulling. Clara picked up the forged document carefully, wrapped it back in the canvas, and tucked it beside the cloth in the locked box under her floorboard that she had started keeping 3 days ago, which told her something about how much her understanding of her own situation had shifted. A week ago, she had been a woman in grief. Now she was a woman keeping evidence under her floor. She blew out the lamp. In the dark, she said, "The bank closes at 4. Briggs leaves by 5. Tell me who cleans his office and when." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "His name is Pete Garrett. He goes in at 6, after everyone's gone. Takes about an hour." "Then we have 1 hour," Clara said, "and we need Pete Garrett to not be there for it." Outside, the summer night was warm and very still, and somewhere up the valley a coyote was running, and the mountains sat against the sky the way they always had, indifferent and permanent, keeping their own secrets about everything that happened in the dark at their feet. Clara sat in the dark cabin her brother had built with his own hands, and she thought about the lock on the bank's back door, and the painting of the mountain that everyone said was ugly, and the journal of a man who had arranged to have her brother killed and then sat at a church supper eating his plate clean while the whole valley watched her sit alone at an empty table. She was not afraid. She was not even angry anymore. Not exactly. What she was, she decided, was certain. And certainty, she had learned this in the last week, was a much more useful thing to be. Pete Garrett was a man who liked his routines the way some men liked their whiskey, not because the routine was particularly good, but because the predictability of it was its own kind of comfort. Every weekday at 6 in the evening, he came through the bank's side door with his cleaning bucket and his ring of keys, and he spent approximately 50 minutes sweeping floors and emptying wastebaskets and wiping down the counter glass, and then he went home to his supper. He had been doing this for 4 years. He had never, as far as anyone knew, looked at a single document in Harlan Briggs's private office. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who kept his eyes pointed at the floor and was grateful for the steady employment. Clara had learned all of this in about 40 minutes of careful conversation at Garrity's store, spread across 2 separate visits, by asking questions that never quite pointed at what she was actually trying to find out. It was a skill she hadn't known she had until this week, the ability to talk around the edge of what she needed without touching the center of it, to let other people fill in the spaces with information they didn't realize they were giving. Thomas had been better at numbers. She was better at people. She was only now understanding how useful that was. The plan for Pete Garrett was Silas's, and it was simple enough to be plausible. His cattle operation on the North Ridge occasionally needed day labor, and it was not unusual for him to come into town looking to hire a hand for a week's work. He found Pete outside the barber shop on Tuesday afternoon and offered him 3 days' wages for 2 days' fence work starting that evening. The north fence line, he said, had a section down, and he needed it before the week's end. Pete, who had a wife and 2 young children, and who found 3 days' wages for 2 days' work to be a genuinely exciting proposition, said yes before Silas had finished the sentence. So, at 6 o'clock on Tuesday evening, Harlan Briggs's bank was clean, locked, and empty. And Clara Whitlock was standing in the alley behind it with a bent piece of wire and considerably more knowledge about lock mechanisms than any respectable woman in Dry Hollow was supposed to have. The knowledge had come from Thomas, which felt appropriate. When they were young, growing up in a cabin with a father who lost keys with such regularity that half their existence was spent locked out of things, Thomas had spent one winter learning everything there was to know about pin tumbler locks from a pamphlet he'd traded 2 glass marbles for. He had taught Clara as a game the way older siblings teach younger ones things that are slightly forbidden, with great enthusiasm and no sense of the future consequences. She had not used the skill in 15 years. Her hands remembered it anyway. The back door of the bank was a simple 5-pin lock, and it gave her less trouble than she expected, which she chose to interpret as the universe being the slightest bit cooperative for once. She eased the door open and slipped inside and stood very still in the dark for a count of 30, listening for anything that shouldn't be there. The bank was full of the specific silence of buildings that hold money, a heavy, pressurized quiet that felt like it was aware of itself. She moved toward the back office without a lamp. She had walked the route in her head so many times in the past 2 days that her feet found their way without needing her eyes. The door to Briggs' private office was unlocked. She had counted on this. A man with a reputation for security would lock the building and feel safe inside it, wouldn't necessarily lock the inner room when he wasn't there. And she was through it, and at the painting of the mountain inside 2 minutes. The painting was as ugly as advertised. It depicted a mountain range in flat, graceless colors that suggested the painter had never actually looked at a mountain, but had heard them described by someone who also hadn't looked. The frame was heavy and swung out from the wall on a hinge on the left side, and behind it was a cavity in the plaster about the size of a bread box, fitted with a small wooden shelf. There were 3 things on the shelf: a locked metal strongbox, a bundle of letters tied with cord, and a slim, dark-covered journal with HJB stamped on the front in faded gold letters. She took the journal. She left everything else. Replacing one item was risk enough. Taking multiple things would announce a search that she could not afford to announce. She eased the painting back to flat, moved back through the dark office and the dark corridor, was out the back door and had it locked behind her in under 8 minutes total. She did not run. Running attracted attention. She walked at the measured pace of a woman who was on her way somewhere and knew where she was going, which was technically true, and she did not look behind her, and the alley was empty, and the street beyond it was occupied only by a dog sleeping in the dust and 2 men outside the saloon who were interested only in each other's conversation. She was at her cabin with the journal in her hands before the last of the evening. Light had gone out of the sky. She lit the lamp and opened it. Harlan Briggs was a meticulous record keeper in the way that some dishonest men are meticulous record keepers, not out of virtue, but out of the need to keep their own accounting straight in the absence of anyone they trusted to do it for them. The journal covered 18 months. It was written in a cramped hand that took her a few pages to calibrate to, and it combined the ordinary business notations of a banker with, beginning about 11 months ago, entries of a different quality entirely. These entries were shorter, more guarded, written in a shorthand that used initials instead of names and dollar amounts that were unattributed to any specific account. But they were sequential, and they were dated, and when Clara laid them against the dates in the altered ledger that she had memorized from her 9 minutes in Prewitt's office, the sequence matched. Entry from February, fund reorganization approved. TW, recommended by ES. Ideal. Visibility without suspicion. TW. Thomas Whitlock. ES. Emmett Swade. Briggs had recorded, in his own handwriting, that Thomas was the ideal choice precisely because he would provide the appearance of legitimate management without raising suspicion. He had chosen her brother deliberately, strategically, as the human face on a fraud he was already running. Entry from April. Transfer completed via account 7714. DC confirms receipt. Second transfer scheduled May. DC, Dale Cutler. There it was. Not an inference, not a reading of circumstantial evidence. The sheriff's initials, recorded by Briggs himself, confirming receipt of transferred funds. Cutler wasn't simply the law enforcement cover for the conspiracy. He was a financial participant. He had been taking money directly. Entry from late May, 11 days before Thomas died. TW has questions about the May receipt. Approached PR. PR notified me same day. Cannot allow this to develop. DC to handle. DC to handle. Clara sat very still for a moment. She was aware of her own breathing, aware of the lamp's small sound, aware of the way the summer darkness outside the window was absolute and warm and indifferent. She read the line again. DC to handle. 4 words in a banker's cramped handwriting, written on a Tuesday in late May, and 12 days later, her brother was dead at the base of a canyon. She kept reading. There were 2 more entries after that one before a gap that lasted 3 weeks. The 3 weeks that included Thomas's death and its official resolution. And then entries resumed in a different register, more relaxed, the shorthand of a man who believed a problem had been solved. Entry from 10 days after Thomas's death. Matter resolved satisfactorily. Fund records corrected. DC, report accepted without question. Whitlock family, sister remains in area. Monitor. She had been mentioned in his journal. Harlan Briggs had written her name in his private record as a potential concern and indicated that she should be watched. She had been sitting at that church supper thinking she was a private grieving woman, and Briggs had already assessed her as something that required monitoring. She closed the journal. She sat there for a moment with her hand flat on the cover, and she thought about what came next in a way that was very specific and very practical, because the alternative was to start feeling the full weight of what she had just read, and she could not afford that yet. She had the cloth from the canyon rim. She had the forged transfer receipt. She had the altered figures in a ledger she could not remove but had memorized. And now she had a journal containing admissions that connected Briggs to the fund fraud and Cutler to the theft, and both of them, by implication, to the decision to eliminate Thomas. What she did not have was any mechanism for getting this evidence to an authority that was not compromised by it. The only law enforcement in Dry Hollow was Cutler and his 2 deputies. The nearest federal marshal's office was in Carver's Junction, 3 days' ride to the southeast across the mountain passes. There was no telegraph in Dry Hollow. Briggs had been quietly discouraging the installation of one for years, and now she understood why. There was no one in this valley whose authority was independent of the men she needed to expose. She was still turning this over when she heard the horse. Not on the road. Cutting across the field south of the cabin, moving too fast for a casual rider, and pulling up hard outside her door. She had the lamp out before the footsteps hit the porch. Pure instinct, moving in the dark before she had consciously decided to. And she was standing to the left of the door with her hand on the iron poker from the fireplace when the knock came. "Clara!" Silas's voice, low, tight, wrong in a way she recognized immediately. She opened the door. He was still on the horse, had barely dismounted, was leaning down from the saddle. His face in the dark had a quality she hadn't seen on it before, urgency that was right at the border of alarm. "Prewitt talked," he said. "I just heard from the man at the feed store. Cutler came in this afternoon asking questions about whether anyone had seen you at the land office recently. And there were 2 riders headed out toward the east road about an hour ago, Rourke and another deputy." Clara processed this in about 3 seconds. "They're going to check the ledger. They're going to find out exactly what you looked at and how long you were there. And when they do, they'll know I saw the altered figures." She looked back at the dark interior of the cabin, at the locked box under the floor, at the journal in her hand. "I need to get out. Both of us," he said. "Tonight." She did not argue. She did not say she needed time to think, or that she wasn't sure, or any of the things that might have been reasonable responses in a different kind of situation. She said, "Give me 4 minutes," and went back inside and moved in the dark with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this possibility in the back of her mind since Tuesday. The locked box came out of the floor, the cloth, the forged receipt, and the journal went into the inside of her coat in the order she was most likely to need them, with the journal at the innermost layer. A change of clothes in the saddlebag she kept packed by the door, out of a habit she'd developed in the last week without consciously deciding to. The small amount of cash she kept in the kitchen tin. Thomas's carved wood horse from the shelf, which she put in her pocket without examining why. She was outside and mounted in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. They went north. Not toward Carver's Junction, which was the obvious route, and therefore the first place Cutler would put men. North first, up into the ridge country that Silas knew the way other men know their own houses, and then east through the high passes once they were clear of the valley floor where riders could be tracked. It was not a comfortable route. The North Ridge at night was a series of decisions made in darkness, and Silas made them without hesitating, picking the trails with a confidence that came from years of moving cattle through terrain that had no patience for uncertainty. Clara rode hard and kept her mouth closed and thought. They were 3 hours into the ride, at an altitude where the night air had gone genuinely cold, and the valley below them was only visible as a cluster of distant lights. When Silas pulled up at a spring and let the horses drink, and Clara said what she had been calculating since they left. "We can't both ride for the marshal," she said. He looked at her over his horse's neck. "If Cutler figures out where we're going, and he will, because there's only one direction that makes sense, he'll put riders on the Carver's Junction road. He has 2 deputies, and he'll call in whatever ranch hands owe him favors." She had the route mapped in her mind, the way Thomas used to map columns of figures, looking for the gaps, the pinch points, the places where the arithmetic failed. The pass through the eastern ridge is 1 trail wide for about 6 miles. If he gets men there ahead of us, we're stopped. "He can't get men there ahead of us," Silas said. We have a head start. We had a head start. We don't know how long ago Rourke left, or whether there's already someone on that road. She watched him. If we split up, one of us draws the pursuit, and one of us gets through. The evidence needs to get through. He was quiet for a moment. The horses drank. Somewhere in the dark above them, something small moved through the brush and settled. That's a reasonable plan, Silas said, in the voice of a man who finds something reasonable and deeply unappealing at the same time. You know this terrain, you know the fast routes to Carver's Junction, and you know every alternate path if the main pass is blocked. You can get there. And you? I grew up on the north side of this valley, Clara said. I know the high meadows above the timberline. If I ride east and high enough, I can draw anyone following us into country that's slow and complicated, and that I know better than Rourke, or any Deputy Cutler hires. I can buy you the time. You'd be alone up there. Thomas was alone on a canyon rim and he was ambushed. I'm choosing the high ground specifically so that doesn't happen to me. She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't soften it. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you the plan. Silas looked at her for a long moment in the dark. She could see that he was running the same route calculation she was running, checking her math the way a good man checks someone else's figures, not because he distrusts them, but because the habit of verification is how you catch the one error that matters. The journal goes with me, he said finally, and the receipt. You take the cloth. The cloth alone isn't enough to— No, he said, but the cloth proves someone was on that rim with your brother, and if I don't get through, you'll need something to start with. He held out his hand across the space between the horses. The journal and the receipt. Clara. She didn't like it, but she understood the logic, and she understood that the evidence had to be split the same way they were splitting, so that the loss of one of them didn't mean the loss of everything. She reached into her coat and handed over the journal and the folded canvas with the receipt inside it, and watched him tuck them into his own coat and felt the absence of them like a physical thing. 3 days, she said. If you're not back in 3 days with federal law behind you, I'll be back in 2, he said. Don't do anything that gets you shot. Likewise, she said. He turned his horse east and was gone into the dark before she had finished watching him go, moving with the swift, low certainty of a man who knew where every rock was. She sat still for a moment, alone on the ridge with the valley lights below her and the cold air moving through the brush and the weight of the cloth in her coat pocket. She turned north, up, into the high meadows where the rock was pale and the trails disappeared into grass, and the stars overhead were so numerous and close that they seemed like something you could navigate by, which was convenient because they were. The next 36 hours were not the worst of Clara Whitlock's life. The worst had been the morning Gerald Henson knocked on the door. But they were close in a different way. Less grief, more purely physical, a steady accumulation of cold and exhaustion, and the particular mental strain of constant alertness. She heard pursuit twice. Once on the first morning, when she saw 2 riders far below her on the meadow's south edge, and spent 2 hours moving along the rocky high line where her horse's prints were invisible. And once on the second afternoon when she heard voices on a trail below her and stopped completely in a stand of pine, and waited for 40 minutes without moving while the voices gradually diminished to the east. She was hungry by the end of the first day and very hungry by the middle of the second. She had packed for speed, not duration, and she was calculating the remaining daylight against her water supply and the estimated distance to the eastern road when she heard the shot. It came from the northeast below her. 1 shot, then 2 more in quick succession, then nothing. She counted to 60, nothing more. Her hands were cold, and she pressed them flat against her horse's neck for the warmth and told herself that 3 shots could mean a dozen different things, and that she had no way of knowing, and that the only productive response was to keep moving. She kept moving. She came down out of the high country on the second evening by a route that brought her out onto the eastern road, approximately 10 miles south of the Carver's Junction cutoff, and she was still deciding whether to risk the road or stay in the tree line when she heard a horse coming from the north. She went still. The horse resolved out of the late daylight into a bay gelding she recognized, and on it a man who was riding with his left arm held slightly different from his right, and who pulled up when he saw her with an expression that she would have called relief if she'd been certain she was reading it correctly, because relief on Silas Boone's face looked almost exactly the same as everything else on Silas Boone's face. "You're hurt," she said. "Grazed," he said. "Rourke's deputy. I'm fine." You were shot. Grazed, he said again, with the specific stubbornness of a man who considers the distinction important. I got past them. I sent word ahead. There's a federal marshal in Carver's Junction, name of Aldous Webb, and the man at the way station agreed to carry the message. Webb should be moving by now. Should be. The man at the way station owed me a favor. He'll deliver it. She looked at his left arm. He was not cradling it exactly, but there was a quality to how he held it that was unmistakable once you were looking for it. You need that looked at. It needs cleaning. I've had worse. That's not reassuring. Wasn't meant to be. He looked at her, a long, straight look that took in the 2 days of hard riding and the cold and whatever was visible on her face from all of it. You're all right. I'm all right, she confirmed. They looked at each other for a moment on the eastern road in the long, slanted light of evening. Two people on tired horses with the mountains behind them and a valley full of dangerous men ahead of them, and a federal marshal who should be moving but might not be, and the specific complicated silence of having been genuinely afraid for someone else and found them alive on the other side of that fear. I heard shots, Clara said. I know. I heard you weren't going to be easy to run down, and I came as fast as I could after. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said most things. I had to be sure. She did not say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say, and she had been learning all week that the things that mattered most in the world were often the ones that didn't need language put around them. How long before Webb can reach Dry Hollow, she said. Day and a half if he moves hard. Maybe less. He turned his horse south toward the road. But we can't wait for him out here. If Cutler figures out I got through, he'll start destroying evidence. The ledger, Clara said immediately. And anything in Briggs's office he can reach. If he knows Webb is coming, he'll have every document in that bank turned to ash before the marshal crosses the valley line. She had known this was coming, had known it from the moment she read Briggs's journal, and understood how completely the man had documented his own crimes, which meant he was also the kind of man who understood exactly how damaging those documents were and would not hesitate to eliminate them the moment he felt the ground shifting. Then we need to get back to Dry Hollow first, before Cutler knows Webb is writing. How likely is it that the way station man keeps quiet? Honestly, Silas said. Not very. He's reliable, but Cutler has people on that road. Clara ran the numbers. A day and a half for Webb to arrive. Unknown time before Cutler learned about the message. The ledger and whatever else Briggs kept at the bank, all of it vulnerable the moment someone warned him. And against all of that, two exhausted people on tired horses with one forged receipt, a stained piece of cloth, and a stolen journal, all of which would be considerably less useful if Briggs had time to concoct a counter-narrative before a federal authority arrived to hear it. She thought about what Silas had said when they sat beside each other at the church supper. The first thing he'd said to her, before his name, before anything, I don't eat with cowards. She thought about it not because it was inspiring, but because it was practical. Cowardice, in this moment, would look like riding south and keeping their heads down and waiting for Aldous Webb to do the work. And if they did that, Briggs and Cutler would have a day and a half to shape the story that Webb arrived to hear. We need to go back, she said, before Webb gets there. To do what exactly? To make sure the evidence survives until he does. She straightened on the horse. And to make sure that when the federal marshal rides into Dry Hollow, he's not riding into a valley where everyone has already been told what to think. Silas considered this. He turned his head slightly, looking east toward the coming dark, then west toward the mountains and the valley behind them. That's going to put us right back in front of Cutler. Yes. He'll know we have the journal. He'll suspect. He doesn't know what I found in the office or what I took. He knows I was at the land office. He knows we ran. He doesn't know exactly what we have. He'll find out. Not if we're back in town before he's finished figuring out where we went. She looked at him directly. Can you ride? He looked at his left arm as if checking in with it. I can ride. Then we ride. They went west as the last of the daylight burned down to orange and then gray, riding hard on the eastern road and then cutting onto the ridgeline trail that Silas knew and Clara was learning, the mountains rising on their left and the valley opening on their right, and the lights of Dry Hollow visible in the distance like a small cluster of problems that had been waiting patiently for them to come back and solve them. Clara rode with the cloth in her pocket and the specific knowledge of what they were riding toward, And she did not think about being afraid because fear was not an actionable state, and she needed every part of her mind for things that were. She thought instead about Briggs's journal tucked inside Silas's coat. She thought about the altered ledger in Prewitt's office. She thought about Emmett Swade, who had told Briggs that Thomas Whitlock was too stubborn to cut a corner, and who had been right. She thought about her brother, who had found a number that didn't belong and had kept looking at it even as it got bigger and more dangerous because that was who he was. Too stubborn to look away. Too honest to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. Too good, in the particular ordinary way of a man who would fix your barn roof for free and hum a tuneless song over his figures and never, not once, take something that wasn't his. They killed him for that, for being exactly who he was. She was going to make sure that when Aldous Webb rode into this valley and took Harlan Briggs and Dale Cutler into federal custody, every person in Dry Hollow understood precisely what had been done and who had done it and what it had cost. Not just Thomas, but every miner who had put money into that emergency fund in good faith, every person who had moved away from her at that church supper because the men with the power to ruin them had pointed in her direction and said thief. She was going to make sure they all understood what they'd been part of. Not to punish them, she was tired of punishment, but because a community that didn't understand how it had been manipulated would simply be manipulated again, differently, by the next man who understood how to use a town's need for easy answers against its better nature. The lights of Dry Hollow grew slowly larger as they rode, and the mountains behind them kept their silence. And somewhere ahead of them, a day and a half away, a federal marshal named Aldous Webb was either on his horse or he wasn't, and either way, Clara Whitlock was going home. Silas pulled up briefly on the ridge above the valley, where the trail gave a clear view of the town below. At this hour, most of the lights were in the saloon and the sheriff's office, the two establishments in Dry Hollow that never quite closed. There was a lamp in the bank's upper window, too, which meant either Briggs worked late or he was already doing exactly what she had feared he'd do the moment he felt the ground move. "The bank window," she said. "I see it. He's already started." "Maybe," Silas said, "or maybe he just works late. Do you believe that?" He was quiet a moment. "No." "Then we don't have a day and a half," she said. "We have tonight." She touched her horse's flank and went down off the ridge toward the valley, and Silas came behind her, and the lights of Dry Hollow rose up around them the way the water rises around a stone dropped into a river, complete and immediate and cold, closing over everything like the town had always been there, and they had simply been away from it for a little while, and it had been waiting, patient and unchanged, for them to come back and finish what had started at a church supper table when a man crossed a silent crowd and sat down beside a woman that everyone else had decided to abandon. She did not go to her cabin. Her cabin was the first place Cutler would check, and she needed time before that happened. She went instead to the one place in Dry Hollow she hadn't been since the first day after Thomas died, the place she had avoided because going back to it felt like picking at something that hadn't begun to heal yet, and which now she understood she had been wrong to avoid, because what was inside it wasn't just grief, it was evidence. She went to Thomas's office at the land office, with its locked door and its narrow shelf and the desk where her brother had sat for 4 months doing figures in his careful hand. His particular stubbornness was obligated to do about it. She still had the wire. The land office lock took her longer this time. Her hands were cold from the ride and her fingers weren't working with the same precision they'd had 2 nights ago, and she spent nearly 4 minutes crouched at the door before she felt the last pin give and the mechanism turn. She was inside and moving toward the back room before she'd fully straightened up. Silas stood watch at the alley entrance with his horse's reins in his good hand and his eyes on the street. His left arm had stopped bleeding sometime during the ride back down the mountain, which he had mentioned with the same tone a man uses to note that the weather had cleared, as if it were mildly positive information that did not require further discussion. Clara had decided not to push the subject. He was upright and alert, and that would have to be sufficient for now. She found what she was looking for in the bottom drawer of Thomas's old desk, behind a stack of blank forms that nobody had moved. It was a separate ledger, smaller than the main one, the kind a man keeps for his own private accounting when he doesn't yet trust what he's seen in the official record. Thomas had been meticulous about his own figures his entire life. The idea that he would simply accept a discrepancy without creating his own parallel record to check it against was so inconsistent with who he was that Clara was almost surprised it had taken her this long to look. The small ledger was in Thomas's hand throughout. No alterations, no second handwriting, no figures that had been changed after the fact. It was his clean accounting of every transaction he had processed for the miners' emergency fund from February through the end of May. Every deposit, every expenditure, every transfer. And on the last 3 pages, in the compressed marginal script she had come to recognize as his thinking on paper hand, he had laid out the discrepancy in precise mathematical terms. He had found $2,310 unaccounted for across 11 separate transactions. He had traced each one to an originating authorization that carried Briggs's countersignature. He had noted the dates, the account numbers, and next to one entry, the May transfer, the one whose forged receipt Silas was carrying in his coat, he had written 4 words that hit Clara somewhere behind the sternum with the force of something physical. "This is not mine." 4 words. His handwriting. His insistence in writing, on a record that proved he knew the difference between what was his and what wasn't, even before he understood exactly what he was looking at. Her brother had sat at this desk and written those 4 words with full knowledge that if he was right, he was in the middle of something that would not end simply, and he had written them anyway, because he was Thomas, and Thomas had never been able to make himself look away from a number that didn't belong. She pressed her fingers flat against the page for a moment. Then she closed the ledger and tucked it inside her coat alongside the cloth. She was out of the office and had the door locked again in under 6 minutes. She found Silas at this alley entrance exactly where she'd left him, watching the street with the patient attention of a man who had spent considerable time watching terrain for things that shouldn't be there. "I found his private record," she said quietly. "He documented everything, dates, amounts, account numbers. It cross-references the forged receipt exactly." Silas absorbed this without visible excitement. He received important information the way he received most things, which was by going slightly more still. "How long before Cutler sweeps this building?" "I don't know. Sooner if Prewitt has already talked about my visit. Later if he's more afraid of being implicated than he is of being caught withholding." She looked toward the bank, where the upper window was still lit. "Briggs is still in there." "Burning." "Possibly." She thought about what could and couldn't be replaced. The journal was already out of the bank. That was the most dangerous document for Briggs, the one that put his own words in his own handwriting directly next to a murdered man's name. The altered ledger was still in Prewitt's office. Briggs could destroy whatever was in the bank, but the ledger was land office property, and Prewitt's nerve might not hold up to the kind of direct interference that removing it would require, especially this late in the game. "We need to be visible in town before sunrise." Silas looked at her. "Visible. If Cutler comes for us in the dark, we have a problem with witnesses. If we're standing in the middle of Main Street in broad daylight when he tries to take us in, every person in this town sees exactly what's happening." She had been building this thought since the Ridge, laying its pieces in order, checking them the way Thomas checked figures. He can't arrest us quietly if the whole town is watching. And if the whole town is watching, then when Webb rides in, the town already knows what happened before Webb has to explain it to them, Silas said, which makes it considerably harder for Briggs and Cutler to shape the narrative afterward. He was quiet for a moment, running it the same way she had. "That's a significant risk," he said. "Cutler has deputies. He has a jail, and he has legal authority in this jurisdiction until Webb arrives to supersede it. If he decides to arrest us anyway, in front of witnesses or not, then we get arrested in front of witnesses," Clara said, which is a very different situation from getting disappeared on a mountain trail. He didn't argue with that. She had noticed that Silas Boone did not argue with correct logic simply because it was uncomfortable. It was one of the things about him that she had come to rely on, which struck her as remarkable given that she had known him for less than 2 weeks. "Where do we go until sunrise?" he said. "Emmett Swade's depot. He's the only person in this valley I'm certain isn't under Cutler's thumb. And the only reason I'm certain is that Cutler has no reason to need him." She paused. "And he liked Thomas." They moved through the dark town with their horses on lead, walking quietly along the back edge of the buildings. And Clara thought about all the times she had walked these same streets in ordinary life, going to the store, going to the post, the 1,000 small errands of a small-town existence that she had conducted with so little attention to any of it because she had never had any reason to think about whether she was safe. Safety had simply been the condition she existed in, invisible the way water is invisible to a fish, and she had not understood until this week what it felt like to step outside it. Emmett Swade answered his door at the first knock, which meant he hadn't been asleep, and his expression when he saw the two of them on his porch. Clara with her traveling clothes stiff with dust, and Silas holding his arm with the careful, studied casualness of a man trying not to show that it hurt, moved through surprise and into something that looked more like grim recognition. "Come in," he said, and stood aside without asking questions. Inside, while Emmett's wife Dora heated water and found clean cloth for Silas's arm without being asked, moving with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been managing emergencies for 50 years, Clara laid out what she had, piece by piece, on Emmett's kitchen table. The cloth. Thomas's private ledger. She told him about the altered figures in the main ledger, about the forged receipt, about the journal that Silas was carrying. Emmett sat across the table and listened to all of it without interrupting. He was 73 years old and had been in this valley long enough to have built a mental map of it that included everything that had ever happened within its borders. And as Clara talked, she could see him placing each piece of information against that map, locating it, connecting it to other things he knew. When she finished, he sat in silence for a moment. "I told Briggs Thomas was the honest man he needed," Emmett said. He said it quietly, and there was something in his voice that was not quite guilt, but was in the same county as it. "I thought I was doing Thomas a favor, getting him a good volunteer position." "You couldn't have known," Clara said. "No," Emmett said, "but I've been knowing something was wrong with Briggs for about 2 years, and I kept it to myself because I didn't have anything solid to put my finger on, and I told myself it wasn't my business." He looked at his hands, then at Clara. "That's a kind of cowardice I'm going to be living with for some time." Clara looked at him. "I need you to tell people," she said, "in the morning. Whatever you know, whatever you've suspected, I need people in this town to hear it from someone they've trusted for decades, not just from me." "They know what I'll say is true," Emmett said. "That's why I'm asking you." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that commits to a thing. "What else?" "The miners," Silas said. He was sitting with his arm cleaned and wrapped, and the operation had clearly been painful in a way that he had communicated only through the complete immobility of his face during the process. "The men whose money was in that fund, who speaks for them?" "Frank Darrow," Emmett said immediately. "He organized the fund in the first place, drove it through the town meeting over Briggs's objections, though I never understood at the time why Briggs objected, because he turned around and offered to manage the account pretty quick once it was approved." "Of course he did," Clara said. "Frank's a reasonable man," Emmett said, "and he's got about 30 miners who trust his word. If he understands what happened, he'll make sure they understand it." "Can you reach him tonight?" "His place is about a mile east. I can go." "We need him here before sunrise," Clara said. Emmett stood, already reaching for his coat. His wife Dora, from the stove, said, "I'll make coffee," in the tone of a woman who understood that the night was not close to over. While Emmett was gone, Clara sat at the kitchen table and did something she had not allowed herself to do since the first day, which was to simply stop moving for long enough to feel what was underneath all the motion. She was exhausted in a way that had gone past physical and into something structural, the kind of tired that lives in your bones and makes the ordinary weight of your own hands feel considerable. She was also, she realized, frightened. Not of Cutler, not exactly. She had been managing Cutler as a practical problem for days, and practical problems had the advantage of being addressable. What she was frightened of was the gap between what she had and what a federal marshal would need to act decisively, and whether a day and a half was actually enough time, and whether Aldous Webb was the kind of man who would arrive ready to see clearly or the kind who would arrive looking for reasons to wait. Silas was watching her from across the table. He had a cup of Dora's coffee in his good hand, and he was not pretending to look at anything else. "Say it," she said. "You're second-guessing Webb. I'm considering the possibility that he arrives and Briggs and Cutler give him a version of events that requires more time to untangle than we have. He'll have the journal. He'll have our word that the journal is genuine. Briggs will say it's fabricated. Cutler will back him. Prewitt will say whatever keeps him safest." She pressed her palms against the table. "I need people in this town to speak before Webb arrives. I need the story to already be turning before a federal marshal shows up, and Briggs has the opportunity to position himself as the reasonable, established, respected citizen, and me as the hysterical, grieving sister who stole a private document. You did steal a private document. I know that. Webb will know that. Yes, she said. And the only thing that makes that survivable is if the weight of what the document contains is so undeniable and so many people in this town are already speaking to it that the question of how it was obtained becomes secondary. She looked at him. Which means tomorrow morning can't just be Silas Boone and Clara Whitlock standing in the middle of Main Street. It has to be more than that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Emmett, Frank Darrow. Who else? Martha Aldridge. He looked surprised. It was one of the few times she had seen that expression on him. Martha Aldridge is the loudest voice in this valley, Clara said. She's also the woman who said, at the church supper, that the apple doesn't fall far. If Martha Aldridge stands in the middle of Main Street and says she was wrong, every woman in Dry Hollow hears it, and their husbands hear that they heard it. She paused. I don't like Martha Aldridge. I'm not sure I ever will. But she's not dishonest. She's afraid, same as everyone. If she sees which way this is going, she'll get in front of it. That's who she is. You're asking a woman who insulted you publicly to become a public witness on your behalf. I'm asking a woman who has influence to use it in the right direction. What she said about me is separate. Clara looked at her coffee cup. Thomas used to say you have to work with the material you've got, not the material you wish you had. That was about bookkeeping, but it applies. Emmett returned at midnight with Frank Darrow, who was a short, broad-shouldered man of about 50 with a miner's hands and a directness of expression that suggested he did not believe in taking the long way to a point. He sat down, looked at the evidence on the table, listened to Clara without interruption, and asked 2 precise questions about the account numbers and the transfer dates. When she answered both correctly from memory, something in his face resolved. The men in that fund worked hard for that money, he said. Some of them had it in there for emergency, illness, injury, lost seasons. That money was the difference between a family making it and a family leaving the valley. His voice was flat and controlled, the voice of a man keeping something large on a very short leash. You're telling me Briggs took it with a badge and a pen and then put a dead man's name on it? Yes, Clara said. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. What do you need? She told him. They talked until 3 in the morning, the 4 of them at Emmett's kitchen table with Dora keeping the coffee going and the windows dark against the rest of the valley's sleep. And by the time it was finished, Clara had a framework for the morning that was as solid as anything could be when it depended on human beings doing difficult things under pressure. Frank would have miners at the Main Street by 7. Emmett would speak to Martha Aldridge at first light. He was the only person in the valley she reliably listened to. Silas would handle the horses and the positioning and the practical geography of not being cornered, and Clara would walk into the center of town and say what she knew in front of everyone who was there to hear it. She slept for 3 hours on Emmett's sitting room floor with her coat as a blanket, and it was the most sleep she had gotten in a week. And when Dora woke her at 5:30, she came awake quickly, without the usual terrible lag of grief, because her mind had already organized itself around what was coming and was simply waiting for the rest of her to catch up. The morning came in stages, first gray, then a thin gold line along the eastern ridge, then the gradual population of Main Street with the ordinary movements of a town beginning its day. The bakery opening, horses at the trough, a freight wagon coming in from the South Road. Frank Darrow had kept his word. By 6:30, there were 11 miners standing in loose, deliberate groupings along the east side of the street, men with the particular physical stillness of people who had been told to be present and to watch and to do nothing else unless circumstances required otherwise. Emmett was at Martha Aldridge's door at 6. Clara didn't know what he said to her. She never asked. Whatever it was, Martha was standing on the boardwalk in front of the general store at 7:15 with her arms folded and her expression complicated in a way that Clara chose not to look at too carefully, because she needed her focus for other things, and Martha's conscience was Martha's business. Clara rode into Main Street at 7:30 on her horse that smelled of 2 days of mountain riding and probably looked the same. She stopped in the middle of the street and dismounted and stood there, which was all she did at first, and the morning continued its business around her for about 30 seconds before the stillness of her standing began to register, and people slowed and stopped and turned. She waited until she had an audience of perhaps 20 people, not counting the miners who were already there, or Silas, who was positioned at the north end of the street with a sightline to both the bank and the sheriff's office. Then she spoke. She did not shout. She had discovered in the last week that the voice most worth listening to was the one that didn't need to shout, that simply said the thing clearly and trusted the air to carry it to the people it needed to reach. She spoke the way Thomas had written his private ledger, in sequence, in order, with every number and date and name where it belonged. She started with February, with Briggs going to Emmett Swade and asking for an honest man, and Emmett giving him Thomas's name, and the fund reorganization that had created the structure Briggs needed. She described the transactions, the amounts, the dates, the account numbers she had memorized from Thomas's private ledger. She described finding the altered figures in the main ledger at the land office. She described the forged transfer receipt with her brother's name on it in handwriting that was not her brother's. She described what Silas had seen from the canyon overlook: the two horses, the two figures, the disturbed ground, the single set of boot prints walking away. She said Dale Cutler's name. She said Harlan Briggs's name. She said them clearly, in the middle of Main Street, with the morning light full on her face and 20 people standing in the street listening and more coming out of doorways and stopping on the boardwalk to listen. She was about 4 minutes into it when the door of the sheriff's office opened. Cutler came out onto the porch with his deputy Rourke behind him, and he looked at the crowd and then at Clara with an expression she recognized. Not anger exactly, more the specific calculation of a man deciding in real time whether a situation was recoverable. He put his thumbs in his belt and started across the street, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds always parted for Cutler, out of long habit. He stopped about 10 feet from her. "Miss Whitlock," he said with the easy social confidence he'd deployed at the church supper. "This isn't the time or place for—" "I'm nearly done," Clara said. She said it calmly and kept speaking. Cutler let her get through another sentence before he said, louder, "Miss Whitlock, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me and—" "Let her finish." The voice came from the miner's side of the street. Frank Darrow. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm in the way of a man who had decided that this was the line and had no interest in moving it. Cutler looked at Frank. Frank looked back. Behind Frank, 11 miners were very still. Cutler looked at the crowd. The crowd was not moving away from Clara this time. They were standing where they were, looking back at him, and something in the quality of that stillness was different from the stillness at the church supper. That had been the silence of people avoiding a difficult situation. This was the silence of people who had arrived at a difficult situation and were waiting to see how it resolved. Clara kept speaking. She talked about the journal. She did not have it to show. It was in Silas's coat. But she described its contents in enough specific detail that there was no reasonable way to characterize what she was saying as invention or grief-confused accusation. Dates, entries, exact phrasing that she had read in Briggs's cramped hand. D.C. to handle. She said it in the middle of Main Street in Dry Hollow and watched Dale Cutler hear it and watched the calculation in his face shift from recoverable to something else. "That's a lie," Cutler said. But his voice had changed. The social ease was gone, and what was underneath it was thinner and less convincing. "Then show people the original ledger," Clara said. "Bring it out here. Let Frank Darrow's men look at the numbers." She held his gaze. "Right now, in front of everyone." He didn't move. Behind him, the bank door opened. Harlan Briggs appeared on the bank's front step, and he was immaculately dressed for 7:30 in the morning, which told Clara he had not slept, and he was carrying himself with the specific careful posture of a man. Managing a situation he knows has moved beyond his preferred terms of engagement. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Clara. He looked at Cutler. "Sheriff," Briggs said with enormous quietness, "I think it's time to—" "The journal's outside, Mr. Briggs," Silas said from the north end of the street. He held it up where the morning light caught the gold letters on the cover. "Would you like to tell these people what's in it, or should Miss Whitlock keep going?" What happened to Briggs's face in that moment was not something Clara had anticipated, because she had been so focused on Cutler that she had underestimated which of them was the more fragile anchor of the partnership. Cutler had a lawman's instinct for managing public situations. Briggs had spent 12 years being the most important man in a small valley, which meant he had spent 12 years in a world where his authority was never publicly challenged, And the challenge of it, the specific exposure of standing on his bank's front step, while a crowd of people listened to the accounting of his crimes, did something to his composure that 12 years of careful construction could not hold against. "Those documents were stolen," Briggs said, and his voice was wrong, too high and too clipped. "That woman broke into my bank and—" "You wrote it yourself," Emmett Swade said. He had come around the corner from the west with Martha Aldridge 3 steps behind him, and his voice was the quietest thing in the street, but it carried because Emmett's voice always carried. "In your own hand. I've known Harlan Briggs for 9 years, and I'm telling this town right now that those initials mean what Clara says they mean, because there's only one HJB in this valley." Martha Aldridge stepped forward. Clara watched her do it, watched the effort it cost her, the particular stiffness of a woman who was accustomed to being right, stepping into a situation in which she had been publicly wrong. "I said things at the church supper," Martha said, "about Clara and her family, and I was repeating what I'd heard, which I should have known better than to do without asking more questions." She stopped there. It was not an elaborate apology. It was an honest one, which was more valuable. Cutler looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at the crowd, then at Cutler, and something in Rourke's expression was doing its own calculation. The calculation of a young deputy reassessing exactly which side of this morning he wanted to be standing on when it was over. "Arrest her," Cutler said to Rourke. "She stole from the bank. She's been spreading false." "For what?" Frank Darrow said. He had moved from the east side of the street to stand directly between Rourke and Clara, and the 11 miners had moved with him in the unhurried way of men who had agreed in advance about exactly how far they were willing to let this go. "For telling the truth in the middle of Main Street? Write that charge up, son. Write it up right here, where we can all see it." Rourke did not move. Cutler said his name again, harder. Rourke looked at Cutler, and what came across his young face, the face of someone who had been a deputy for 18 months and had spent those 18 months learning not to ask why, was the specific expression of a person understanding something for the first time about the nature of the authority they had been borrowing and what it was going to cost them when the invoice came due. "I'm not arresting her," Rourke said. The street was absolutely quiet. Cutler looked at Rourke for a long moment, then he looked at the crowd. Then he looked at Clara, and what she saw in his face had shifted again, past calculation and past management, and into something rawer than either of those. Something that was partly fury and partly the particular cold fear of a man watching the structure he built beginning to come apart at the base. He put his hand on his sidearm. The miners moved. Not toward him. They didn't have to. They simply redistributed themselves in the space between Cutler and Clara in a way that was not dramatic or hostile, but was completely unambiguous. And Frank Darrow said, very quietly, "Don't." The moment stretched. It stretched long enough for Clara to hear the specific sounds of the morning. A horse at the trough, the bakery's oven door somewhere down the block, a child somewhere asking a question, and it stretched long enough for her to understand that what happened in the next 30 seconds would determine whether this morning ended as a public reckoning or as something else entirely. And then, from the south end of Main Street, there was the sound of horses. Not one or two. Several, moving at a purposeful pace, and every person in the street turned to look, and coming up the road from the south was a group of 6 riders, and the man at the front was wearing a badge that was not Dry Hollow's badge. And his name, Clara did not yet know, but she would learn it in the next 30 seconds. And it was Aldous Webb, and he had ridden through the night. He had ridden through the night, which meant the man at the way station had been faster than Silas had estimated, which meant that instead of a day and a half they had gotten, in the end, something much closer to a day, which was exactly how long it had taken Clara Whitlock to come back to this town and stand in the middle of its main street and say what she knew. Webb pulled up his horse and looked at the scene in front of him. The crowd, the miners, the sheriff, with his hand on a weapon he hadn't drawn, the woman in the middle of the street. And his face did the rapid, experienced reading of a man who had ridden into 100 difficult situations and knew how to locate the center of them quickly. His eyes found Clara. "You'd be Miss Whitlock," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have a message from a man named Silas Boone saying you have evidence of a federal crime." "I have several pieces of evidence," Clara said. "Some of it is in my coat. Some of it is in that man's coat at the north end of the street. And some of it is in the land office, in the original handwriting of the victim, cross-referencing everything else." Webb looked at Cutler, looked at the hand near the weapon. His voice stayed completely level. "Sheriff, I'm going to ask you to take your hand away from that firearm." Cutler looked at Webb, at the 5 federal riders behind him, at Rourke, who had not moved to support him, at the miners, at the crowd. He took his hand away from the firearm, and across Main Street in the early morning light, in front of every person in Dry Hollow who had spent the past 2.5 weeks choosing the easier and more cowardly version of events, the balance of the valley shifted on its axis with a slow, grinding, irresistible weight, the way a very large stone shifts when the water underneath it has finally done enough work. Clara looked at Thomas's carved wooden horse in her coat pocket. She could feel its small weight through the fabric. She put her hand over it and held it there. Aldous Webb was not a dramatic man. That was the first thing Clara understood about him in the hour that followed his arrival on Main Street. He did not perform his authority, did not make speeches, did not arrange the scene for effect. He simply began working, methodically and without apparent emotion, the way a man works when he has done something many times and has learned that efficiency is more useful than theater. He sent 2 of his riders to the sheriff's office immediately, with instructions that were quiet enough that Clara couldn't hear them from where she stood, but whose result was that Cutler and Rourke were inside the building with a federal rider at the door within 4 minutes of Webb's arrival. He sent a 3rd rider to the bank with Silas, who handed over the journal and the forged receipt with the careful deliberateness of a man transferring something he has been responsible for and is relieved to put in different hands. He asked Clara to come with him to the land office, and she did. And she watched him read Thomas's private ledger at Prewitt's desk with the focused attention of a man who understood figures, turning pages slowly, going back twice to check specific entries against each other. Prewitt sat in the corner of his own office the entire time, occupying approximately as little space as a man his size could occupy, looking at the floor. He had arrived at the land office to find a federal marshal already inside it, which had produced in him a rapid sequence of visible calculations that ended in a kind of collapse. Not dramatic, more like a slow deflation, the expression of a man whose structure of careful non-involvement had been definitively overtaken by events. Webb looked up from the ledger once, at Prewitt, and said, "Were you aware of the alterations to this record?" Prewitt said nothing for a moment. Then, "I was told not to look at it." "By whom?" "Mr. Briggs." A pause. "And the sheriff." "And you complied?" Yes." Another pause, smaller. "I have a family." Webb looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has heard this particular explanation many times and has developed a specific relationship with it, not without sympathy, but not particularly moved by it either. "You'll need to make a formal statement," he said. "Everything you were told, by whom and when. Everything you saw and chose not to report. All of it." He looked back at the ledger. "Cooperation at this stage will be taken into account." Prewitt said yes, he understood, in the voice of a man for whom the worst part of this experience was not the legal jeopardy, but the simple fact of being seen clearly, finally, as exactly who he was. Clara stood near the window and watched the street outside while Webb finished his examination. The crowd that had gathered for her statement was dispersing slowly, the way crowds disperse after something significant. Not all at once, but in gradual clusters, people stopping to speak to each other, heads bent together, the specific body language of a community processing information it was not prepared for. Frank Darrow's miners had not dispersed. They were still on the east side of the street in their loose groupings, patient and present, and she understood that they would stay until they were certain the morning had resolved in the direction it needed to resolve, because the money in that fund was not abstract to them. It was seasons of work. It was winter insurance. It was the difference between staying and leaving, and they were not going anywhere until they had seen the people who took it put into federal custody with their own eyes. She understood that. She respected it. She also knew it was not enough, that custody today did not equal justice, and justice did not equal the restoration of what had been taken, but it was the necessary first step, and watching Frank Darrow stand in that street with his arms folded was the first thing in 3 weeks that had felt, to some small degree, like the world was operating in the correct direction. Webb closed Thomas's ledger and stood. He looked at Clara. "This is thorough work," he said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without excess. "That's my brother's work," Clara said. I just found it. Webb looked at her for a moment with the attentiveness of a man recalibrating something. Then he said, "The journal you retrieved from the bank. I need you to understand that its admissibility will depend on how it was obtained, and that this is going to complicate the legal process." "I know," Clara said. "Do you understand the degree to which it may complicate it?" "I broke into his bank. I understand what that means." She held his gaze. "But the journal exists, and it says what it says. And that's in your hands now, not mine." She paused. "What I retrieved from this office was a private ledger that belonged to my brother. I have somewhat more defensible ground there." Webb considered this. "Your brother's ledger, the cloth from the canyon rim, and the forged receipt are sufficient to open a federal investigation with full authority. The journal adds," he paused, choosing his word, "considerable weight. How it's handled will be a question for the federal prosecutor." "What matters," Clara said, "is that you have enough to hold them." "Yes," Webb said, "I have enough to hold them." He said it simply, and it was a simple thing, and Clara stood in Prewitt's office where her brother had worked for 4 months discovering a crime that killed him, and she held on to the carved wooden horse in her pocket through the fabric of her coat, and she let out a breath that she thought might have been building since the morning Gerald Henson knocked on her door with his hat in his hands. The arrests happened without incident, which Clara had not entirely anticipated. She had imagined, in the small hours of the previous night at Emmett's table, running scenarios, that Cutler might make a physical confrontation of it, that Briggs might try to flee, that something would go wrong in the way things went wrong when men with power were cornered. But Briggs, when Webb walked into his office with 2 federal writers, simply sat down in his chair and said nothing and asked to see the charges in writing, which Webb provided. He looked at them for a long time. He said, "This is based on documents that were illegally obtained." Webb said, "Among others, yes. You'll have the opportunity to make that argument." Briggs said nothing else. Cutler was more difficult, but not in the way Clara had feared. He didn't fight. He talked, or tried to, in the specific way of a man who has spent decades controlling situations through the management of information and who defaulted to that strategy even when the information was no longer his to manage. He told Webb that the evidence was fabricated, that Clara Whitlock had been conducting a personal vendetta since her brother's death, that the journal had been altered or forged. He said this with a certainty that might have been convincing to someone who had not already spent 2 hours reading Thomas's precise, unaltered figures and Briggs's cramped private accounting. Webb listened to all of it without expression. Then he said, "Sheriff Cutler, I have a witness who places 2 horses on the canyon trail the morning Thomas Whitlock died, one of which carried a rider with a lawman's badge. I have a financial record in the alleged victim's own handwriting cross-referencing fraudulent transfers to an account with your authorization. I have a private journal with your initials placed in direct chronological proximity to a directive to eliminate a witness." He paused. "You'll have the opportunity to make your arguments to a federal court." Cutler looked at him for a moment. Then, with the specific deflation of a man who has run out of moves, he looked away. The cells in the Dry Hollow Sheriff's Office held both men through that first day and night, under the supervision of Webb's writers, while Webb and his team worked through the documentation with the systematic thoroughness of people who had done this before and understood that the quality of the initial record building would determine everything that came after. Clara gave a formal statement that ran nearly 4 hours, which was the most exhausting thing she had done in a week, full of exhausting things, because it required her to reconstruct every step in precise sequential order and to be honest about the parts that were legally ambiguous, which she was, because the alternative was to introduce a fragility into the case that could be exploited later. Silas gave his own statement separately, and when they compared notes afterward, sitting on the steps of Emmett Swade's depot in the late afternoon with cups of coffee gone cold in their hands, they found that their accounts matched not just in substance but in specific detail, which was the best possible outcome, because matching accounts built by 2 people who had no opportunity to coordinate during the statement process were the kind of thing that held up under cross-examination. "How's the arm?" Clara said. "Healing," he said. He said it in the tone that indicated the subject was closed. "Webb's going to need you to testify." "I know. In Carver's Junction, probably. Possibly further, depending on where they try the federal charges." "I know that too." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I've got cattle on the North Ridge." They'll keep. I know, he said for the third time, and the repetition of it was not irritation. It was something else, something more like a man reassuring himself that the things he was being asked to put aside were genuinely going to be there when he got back to them. Clara understood that. She had been putting things aside for 3 weeks. At some point, you had to start picking them back up. The formal transfer of Briggs and Cutler to federal jurisdiction happened 2 days later, when Webb's team had completed their initial documentation and a wagon with additional federal riders arrived from Carver's Junction. The town turned out for it, not in the organized, deliberate way it had turned out for Clara's statement on Main Street, but in the organic, trailing way of people who find themselves standing on the street when something significant is happening and cannot quite bring themselves to go inside. Clara watched from the boardwalk in front of Garrity's store. She had not planned to watch. She had intended to be somewhere else, to let the mechanics of justice proceed without requiring her witnessing, because she was tired and because she was not sure what she wanted to feel, and she didn't want to perform a feeling for an audience. But she found herself there anyway, and she watched Harlan Briggs walk from the sheriff's office to the wagon in his good clothes, still maintaining the careful posture of a man who considered himself a different category of person from most of Dry Hollow, and she thought about him going to Emmett Swade in February and asking for an honest man, and the particular cynicism of a person who understood the value of honesty well enough to weaponize it. Cutler came out after Briggs. He walked with his head up in the specific way of a man who had decided that his remaining dignity resided in his posture, which was the only decision Clara could think of that she had no argument with. She watched him cross the street and climb into the wagon, and she thought about the sound of his voice behind her at the church supper. I'd hate for anyone to lose their appetite sitting near stolen money. And she thought about the fact that the morning he had said that, he had already been watching her with the knowledge of what had been done to Thomas, and that the social ease of it, the casual cruelty of a man performing confidence in public because he believed there was no price for it, was the thing that had made her most angry in all the weeks since. Not afraid. Angry. And the anger, she had learned, was not a problem to be managed. It was a compass. It had pointed her in the right direction every time she had let it. The wagon left. The crowd dispersed. Dry Hollow returned to the ordinary sounds of its ordinary morning, and Clara stood on the boardwalk for a while longer than was strictly necessary, not because she needed to stand there, but because she was learning, slowly, what it felt like to not be running towards something or away from something for the first time in 3 weeks. It felt strange, unstructured, like standing in a room where the furniture had been moved. She would get used to it. The weeks that followed were neither simple nor neat, because nothing in the real world is simple or neat after something like this, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either selling you comfort or has never actually had to live through the aftermath of a truth coming out. The truth had come out. That didn't mean everything was immediately fixed. Prewitt's formal statement confirmed the essential structure of the conspiracy and established his knowledge of the ledger alterations. And because he cooperated fully and immediately, and because Webb's prosecutor determined that his role had been passive rather than active, he had not moved money, had not been on the canyon rim, had not signed any documents. He was not charged. He resigned from the land office within the week, packed his family's belongings into a wagon, and left Dry Hollow for somewhere none of them could name. Clara did not think about him very much. He occupied a category in her mind that she had no clean word for. Not innocent, not guilty in the way that mattered, just someone who had made a series of small, fear-driven choices that had added up to complicity, and who would spend the rest of his life knowing that. The federal case against Briggs and Cutler moved through its processes over the following months with the grinding, impersonal pace of institutional justice, which bore no resemblance to the quick, clear reckoning that people imagined when they thought about the law. There were continuances and filings and arguments about the admissibility of the journal that occupied an attorney in Carver's Junction for 6 weeks, and produced a ruling that admitted it as supplementary evidence to the primary case built on Thomas's ledger and the forged receipt, which was the outcome Webb had expected and which the federal prosecutor called adequate. Adequate was apparently a legal term of some significance. Clara gave testimony in Carver's Junction on a gray November morning, sitting across a table from a federal examiner, while Briggs's hired attorney asked her questions designed to establish that she was unstable, emotionally compromised, and acting from grief rather than evidence. She answered every question in the same flat, precise manner, stating facts and dates and figures with the accuracy of a woman who had been rehearsing them in her own mind for months. And when the attorney suggested that her brother had perhaps been covering his tracks by creating his own parallel ledger to muddy the official record, she looked at him for a long moment and said, "My brother wrote 'This is not mine' next to the forged entry, in his own hand, before anyone was looking." She paused. "That is not what a thief writes." The attorney did not pursue that line further. Silas testified separately about the canyon rim and the two horses and the bad-shaped glint of light in the pre-dawn dark. He was cross-examined on whether he could be certain of the distance, the light quality, the identification of the badge specifically as opposed to some other reflective surface. He answered each challenge with the same calm specificity, and when the attorney tried to suggest that his account might have been shaped by his subsequent relationship with Clara Whitlock, he said, "I saw what I saw before I ever spoke to her. I came to that supper because I'd been carrying it for 6 days, and I needed to give it to someone who had the right to hear it." He said it without defensiveness, a simple statement of fact. The room was quiet for a moment afterward. Briggs was convicted on 3 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of conspiracy in the death of Thomas Whitlock, because the direct murder charge required a standard of proof that the physical evidence, while compelling, could not definitively meet. Silas had seen 2 figures, had heard something wrong, but had not seen the act. The conspiracy charge carried the weight of the journal entry, DC to handle, combined with Briggs's documented motive and the financial structure he had built. He received 12 years. His attorney immediately filed an appeal that went nowhere. Cutler's trial was separate and came 3 weeks later. He was convicted on 2 counts of fraud as a financial beneficiary of the scheme, and 1 count of conspiracy in the death of Thomas Whitlock, with an additional charge related to conducting a fraudulent official investigation. He received 14 years, the additional 2 reflecting the particular seriousness of a law enforcement officer subverting the process he was sworn to uphold. The judge said something in his sentencing statement about the corrosion of public trust that stayed with Clara for a long time, not because it was eloquent, but because it was precise. The harm done here was not only to the individuals directly injured. It was to every person in that valley who learned that the institutions they depended on had been turned against them. That damage does not end with a verdict. She read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table in her cabin on the evening the written judgment arrived in Emmett's mail depot. The cabin was different now. She had rebuilt the portion that Cutler's men had burned. She'd come home the morning after Webb's arrival to find the east wall and the porch gone, reduced to ash and charred wood in the early morning light, and had stood looking at it for a long time before she understood that what she felt was not grief on top of grief, but something more like clarity. They had burned her porch because they were afraid of her. Everything they had done to her had been driven by fear. Fear of exposure, fear of consequence, fear of a woman who would not stop asking questions about a number that didn't belong. And fear, she had learned, was a much weaker foundation than it looked like from the outside. She rebuilt the east wall first, with help she didn't ask for. Frank Darrow sent 2 miners with lumber and a morning's worth of work, and they came without speeches or apologies, just with tools and the practical willingness to put something broken back together. Others came in the weeks after, in the same wordless way, and by the time the first real cold came off the mountains in October, the cabin was whole again and slightly different from what it had been before, which she thought was probably appropriate. The business came later, not immediately. She needed months first, months of testimony and paperwork, and the slow, effortful process of existing in a community that was in the middle of reassessing itself, which was uncomfortable for everyone involved, and which Clara did not try to rush or smooth over, because she had learned enough about false surfaces in the past year to have no interest in constructing one for the sake of other people's comfort. The town needed to sit with what it had done, with the silence it had chosen, with the ease with which it had accepted a story that destroyed a man's name, because accepting it was less costly than questioning it. That reckoning was not hers to manage. It was theirs. But the business. She had been thinking about it since before the trial, in the odd, quiet hours when her mind was not occupied with legal documents or testimony preparation. She thought about what Thomas would have wanted. Not a monument, not a memorial in the civic sense, but something real and useful and ongoing, the kind of thing that had his name on it because the name belonged to someone worth remembering, not because his absence required filling. Whitlock Supply and Sewing opened the following April, in the space formerly occupied by a dry goods store whose owner had retired the previous autumn. Clara had learned to sew from her mother and had been doing it practically her entire life, which meant it was one of the few things she was genuinely competent at that also happened to fill a need in a frontier town where women spent considerable time repairing and producing the things their families wore and used. The supply side was practical: thread, fabric, needles, buttons, the small necessities of domestic production that people traveled to Carver's Junction to find because Dry Hollow didn't have them. She stocked it carefully and priced it honestly and extended credit when she had reason to believe it would be repaid, which was most of the time. The name on the sign was Thomas's. She had not debated it. She had simply written it. Whitlock Supply and Sewing, in letters that were clear and readable and not at all ornate, because Thomas had never been ornate. When she hung the sign on a morning in late April, when the valley was just beginning to come green and the mountains had lost most of their snow, she stood on the boardwalk and looked at it for a while, and she did not cry, which surprised her, and then she didn't, because Thomas would have found that sensible. Emmett Suaide came by that morning, as he came by most mornings, on his way between the mail depot and Garrity's. He stopped and looked at the sign. "Good name for a business," he said. "It is," Clara agreed. He nodded in the specific way of a man who has more to say and is deciding whether to say it. "I'm still sorry," he said finally, "about Thomas, about my part in how it happened." "I know you are," Clara said. "Does that help at all?" She thought about it honestly, which was something she tried to do, to not give the easy answer when the easy answer wasn't true. "It helps that you showed up on Main Street," she said. That helped. He accepted that. He moved on toward Garrity's. She went inside to open for the day. The relationship between guilt and repair was something Clara thought about a good deal in those months, because the community's reckoning with this salve moved in exactly that territory. People came into the shop. Women mostly, at first, then gradually their husbands. And some of them said things, and some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't were sometimes more honest than the ones who did, because an apology can be a way of closing a subject rather than opening it. What Clara found she responded to was not words but behavior. The woman who had turned away from her at the church supper, and who now came in every 2 weeks and spent a little more than she probably needed to, and who never once mentioned what she'd done, and whose regularity was its own kind of statement. Frank Darrow, who sent 2 new miners to her on their first day in the valley with instructions to open an account. Martha Aldridge, who brought her sister-in-law in from out of town specifically to shop at Whitlock, and who said to Clara once, with the directness of a woman who found apology language almost physically uncomfortable, "I run my mouth too fast and too easy. I always have. I'm working on it." Clara had said, "Let me know how that goes," and Martha had looked at her for a startled second and then laughed. And it was the most genuine thing Clara had seen from her, and they understood each other from that point in a way that was not friendship exactly, but was something real and workable. The miners' fund money was returned through the federal restitution process, which moved at the same grinding institutional pace as everything else. The first disbursement came in September, 8 months after the arrests, and they were partial, a portion of the total, the rest pending the liquidation of Briggs's assets through the court process. Frank Darrow distributed what came in at a meeting in the Garrity's back room, going through the ledger with the same precision he applied to everything, and when it was done, he sent Clara a note that said only, "Thomas's accounting was exactly right, every figure. Thank you." She kept the note in the locked box under her floor, next to the carved wooden horse. Silas came back from the North Ridge in November. He had gone up in early September to work cattle through the fall, and had sent word down once, through the feed store man, that the arm was fully healed and the herd was in reasonable shape, and he expected to be down before the first hard snow. The first hard snow came in late October, and he came down 2 weeks after it, which she chose not to comment on. He appeared at her shop door on a Tuesday afternoon when she was in the middle of taking inventory of her button stock, which was a task that required more concentration than it had any right to, and which she was grateful to stop doing. He was wearing the same coat he always wore, which had been cleaned at some point since she'd last seen it. His arm was, as advertised, fine. She could tell by the way he moved, the even distribution of weight and motion that had been slightly wrong when he was protecting the wound. "Business looks steady," he said, looking around the shop. "It is," she said. "Good location." "It's a fine location." She set down the button inventory. How are the cattle? Fine. Lost 2 over the winter, but less than I expected. He looked at the sign through the window. Whitlock Supply and Sewing visible from inside. Good name. That seems to be the consensus. He looked at her then, directly, in the way he had of directing his full attention at a thing without any of the social softening that people usually applied to direct attention. She had been on the receiving end of that look enough times now to have become comfortable with it, which had taken a while, because it was the kind of look that didn't leave room for performing the feeling instead of having it. I've been thinking about the North Ridge, he said. You think about it a lot. It's good country, good grazing, but it's isolated in ways that are starting to feel less like advantages than they used to. He said it without drama, in the voice of a man reporting a conclusion he had reached over a period of time and was now prepared to state. I've been up there a long time. I know. I'd like to be closer to town. Clara looked at him. The Hendersons have a property 2 miles east, she said. They've been considering selling since Gerald's back got worse. I heard that, he said. It's good land, good access to the ridge for grazing without the full isolation. I heard that too. He paused. I'd need someone who knows the valley to tell me if the price they're asking is fair. And you came to me. You know this valley better than most people in it at this point, he said, and you have good judgment about numbers. She almost smiled. The price is about right, she said. Maybe a little high for the south fence situation, which needs significant work. I'd offer 15% below asking and see where they land. He nodded. He had taken that information in and filed it and was now doing something else with his face, which she had learned to read well enough to know meant there was something else he intended to say and was organizing his approach to it. I'm not going to say anything complicated, he said finally, because I don't think it needs to be complicated. I'd like to keep being around, that's all. Clara looked at him for a moment. Outside the window, Main Street moved through its afternoon business. Horses and people and the ordinary machinery of a small town getting on with things. The same street where she had stood 3 weeks after her brother's death and said what she knew in front of everyone who was there to hear it. The same street where Cutler had put his hand on a weapon he hadn't drawn and a young deputy had refused to arrest a woman for telling the truth. It was a changed street. Not entirely, not in all the ways she had hoped for, not as fast as she had wanted. Change in communities moved at the pace of the slowest, honest person, which was not a fast pace, but it moved. You can stay for supper, she said, if you're not in a hurry back. I'm not in a hurry, he said. She went back to her button inventory. He found a chair and sat in it without being invited and without making a production of it, and the afternoon continued around them both, and the shop was quiet in the specific way of a space that has been built with purpose and is doing what it was built to do. And outside the sign with Thomas's name on it caught the late November light and held it for a moment before the angle of the sun shifted and moved on. There were things Clara still carried that she was not done carrying. She understood this and had stopped expecting otherwise. She still woke sometimes in the middle of the night to the specific silence of a cabin where someone used to hum a tuneless song over his figures, and in those moments the grief was as clean and cold as it had ever been. She still felt something complex when she passed the canyon road, which she took when she needed the direct route and avoided when she didn't, which meant sometimes she went the long way for no reason she would explain to anyone. She still picked up Thomas's carved wooden horse sometimes when she was thinking through a difficult problem, turning it in her hand without being aware she was doing it until she looked down and found it there. She had stopped expecting grief to end and had started understanding it as something you learn to carry rather than something you put down. Thomas had been real, and the realness of him did not diminish with time. It changed its character, became less acute and more structural, like a load-bearing wall that you stopped noticing because it was simply part of what held everything up. What she had put down was the expectation that other people would do the right thing without being required to. She had grown up in Dry Hollow believing that communities were fundamentally decent, and she had spent 3 weeks learning that communities were fundamentally human, which meant they were capable of great decency and profound cowardice in roughly equal measure, and that which one showed up in a given moment had a great deal to do with who was willing to stand in the middle of a street and make the cost of the cowardice visible. She had been willing. She had not started out willing. She had started out at a table that everyone had abandoned, furious and humiliated and alone, holding a dish of cold corn pudding while a sheriff said something cruel and the whole valley looked away. She had not chosen that morning's dignity. It had been the only thing left to her, and she had held on to it because letting go of it would have meant agreeing with them, agreeing that Thomas was what they said he was. And that was a thing she was constitutionally incapable of doing. What she had learned, what she would carry the same way she carried the grief, as a structural thing rather than an acute one, was that the truth did not protect itself. It needed someone to find it, and carry it, and say it out loud in a place where it could not be buried again. Not because saying it was comfortable, or because the people who needed to hear it deserved any particular effort on your behalf, but because the alternative was a valley that went on believing a lie, and her brother's name on the wrong side of a story that had been written specifically to end him. Thomas had found a number that didn't belong. He had kept looking at it. He had written, "This is not mine," in the margin of his own private record, which no one but himself was ever intended to read, because even in private, even when there was no audience, he had not been capable of pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen. That was the kind of man he was. Not perfect. He had kept things from her, had carried danger alone to protect her, and in doing so had removed her ability to help him, and that cost them both something she couldn't fully calculate. But honest in the way that mattered most, which was honest even when no one was looking. She wanted to deserve that. Not to be him. She was not him. She was angrier than he had been, and considerably less patient and more likely to pick a lock than to wait for permission, but to be worthy of what he'd been. The way you want to be worthy of the best person you've ever known. She thought she was doing all right. Some days better than others. Most days better than the morning Gerald Henson knocked on the door. The supper that evening was simple. Beans and bread, a pot of something that had been on the stove since mid-afternoon, the kind of food that was honest about itself. Silas ate it the way he ate everything, which was thoroughly and without comment on its quality. Clara ate and talked about the business, the inventory challenges, the credit question, a problem with her supply order from Carver's Junction that had given her 3 weeks of aggravation. He listened and asked specific questions that indicated genuine attention. She found herself describing the button inventory problem that had occupied her afternoon, and he listened to that too, and said something about inventory systems on the ranch that was actually applicable, and she considered it seriously and said she'd try it. It was ordinary. Substantially ordinary, the conversation of two people who had survived an extraordinary thing together and were discovering what they were like in ordinary time. Clara was finding that she liked it, liked him, in ordinary time, in the plain practical dailiness of it, which was a different kind of liking than what had developed in the crisis, and was in some ways more real. After supper, he helped clear the dishes, which she had not asked him to do, and then he put his coat on to leave and stood in the doorway for a moment. "The Henderson land," he said. "I'll go take a look this week." "Let me know what you think of the south fence," she said. "I will." He looked at her. "Clara." "Yes." "I told you once that I don't eat with cowards." He said it simply, looking at her. "I should have said something clearer. I meant that you weren't one. And you weren't. And everything that happened after didn't change that assessment." She looked at him in the doorway, in the November evening with the mountains dark behind the valley and the cabin warm behind her, and she thought about a church supper in the summer, a near-empty table, 60 people who had decided that looking away was cheaper than looking directly, and a man she had never met crossing a silent crowd to sit beside her. "I know," she said. "Thank you for being the one who didn't." He nodded once, without ceremony. He went out into the evening. She heard his horse move off toward the road. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she closed it, long enough to see the lights of Dry Hollow scattered across the valley in the dark, ordinary and imperfect and continuing, the way towns continue, the way people continue, carrying what they carry, making the choices that are available to them, occasionally rising to something better than their worst instincts when someone stands in the middle of a street and gives them a reason to. She closed the door. She picked up Thomas's wooden horse from the counter where she'd set it that morning and turned it in her fingers once and set it back down in its place by the lamp. She had work to do in the morning. The button inventory wasn't going to finish itself.